They said the war ended in Rome. But beneath Montserrat, it never stopped. In 1944, a man followed a voice into a forgotten tunnel, and what he found was never listed in any Allied report. This isn't a story of victory. It's a story of what we were never meant to uncover. I wasn't supposed to be there. My orders were to remain in Tivoli until further notice, assisting with a flow of wounded arriving from the south. That morning, I had just finished cleaning a set of stretchers stained with earth and darker things, when a man in civilian clothes walked into the depot, without knocking. He didn't say his name, only handed me a sealed envelope bearing no crest, no stamp, just a number 42 written in blue ink. Inside was a single sentence in German: "Escort the engineer to the northern tunnels at Montserrat." No explanation, no insignia, and no return address. I asked him who had sent the message. He said nothing, just stood, waiting. That silence said enough. I packed quickly. The man didn't speak during the drive. He wasn't military, but he knew which roads were open, which checkpoints were quiet. He knew where the partisans had struck last, and which bridges had been sabotaged. The only time he looked at me was when we passed a convoy of German vehicles burned to their frames, twisted metal and blackened boots poking from the wrecks. He nodded toward the flames and muttered something in Italian I didn't understand. It sounded like Giesthesia. I didn't ask him to repeat it. By dusk, we reached a narrow dirt path that led away from the main road and into the hills. The jeep stalled once, and he cursed, not at the engine, but at the wind. It had picked up since we left the valley. When we reached the checkpoint near the old monastery, the guard on duty didn't question our presence. He saluted the driver, avoided eye contact with me, and waved us through. I hadn't even shown identification. Montserrat rose before us like a wound in the landscape, a black ridge of rock, jagged and unnatural, half covered by pine and shadow. The western slopes were dotted with concrete entrances, tunnels carved by the Germans of Führer's rumored headquarters, though no official maps confirmed it. The Italians called it La Montagna Vuota, the Hollow Mountain. To them, it had always been haunted, even before the Reich arrived. We parked by a rusted gate, where 2 Wehrmacht soldiers smoked in the cold. One offered me a match, but didn't speak. The driver whispered something to them in a dialect I didn't recognize. They both nodded, turned their backs, and walked toward a nearby shed. The man handed me a flashlight and a small metal key. "Take Tunnel 7, he said. "He's already inside." I started to ask who, but he had already returned to the jeep. The engine didn't start right away. When it did, he reversed down the slope without headlights. Tunnel 7 was unmarked, save for a single white X scratched into the concrete above the archway. The door was open. I clicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. The air changed immediately. The scent of dust and limestone pushed out the pine. The light beam revealed thick cables nailed to walls, all severed, dangling like veins. My boots echoed louder than I expected. The sound bounced back too quickly, as if the walls were closer than they appeared. After 30 meters, the flashlight dimmed. I shook it, hit it once. It flickered back to life. That's when I saw the first set of tracks, boot prints in the dust, leading forward, and beside them, dragging marks. Something heavy, something recent. I followed the path down a slope into a chamber wider than any I'd expected. The ceiling arched into darkness. A set of double doors stood at the far end, one half open. Inside, a single oil lantern hung from a pipe, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The engineer stood beneath it. He didn't turn when I approached, just stared at the wall where a map had been partially burned. Only fragments remained, sections labeled Sudleitang, Außenring, and beneath them, Versiegeln, sealed. He finally spoke without looking. "This isn't the right tunnel." His voice cracked like he hadn't used it in hours, but it's the only one that's still dry. I asked him what we were doing there. He turned then, and I saw that he wore no uniform. His coat was civilian, too large for him, the buttons replaced with mismatched brass and bone. He looked past me. "You were sent," he said, "so I wouldn't be alone." He pulled a sheet from a table behind him. Beneath it lay a device I didn't recognize. Copper coils, 2 glass tubes, a Morse key, and a receiver. He tapped the key once. A soft click echoed into the dark. "We've been listening," he said, "for weeks. But it changed 3 days ago. Different rhythm. Slower. Not code. Not ours." I looked around. There were no wires leading out. No antenna. No power. I asked how it worked. He smiled without teeth. "It doesn't," he said. "Not anymore. But the voice doesn't care." I stepped closer to the table. The receiver was old, but intact. I lifted the earpiece. Static, then something beneath it. Not language, not music, a shape of sound. Breathing, maybe, or something slower. Wet, mechanical. The engineer watched me. It's not meant for us. But we opened the gate too far. And now it remembers. I asked him what it was. He shook his head. "I don't know, but it isn't speaking to the mountain anymore." I lowered the receiver. Behind us, a deep thud echoed through the tunnel. Not close, but not far enough. The engineer looked at me. His eyes were darker now. "It's learning the shape of your name." And then the lantern went out. We entered the village just before noon, and the first thing that struck me wasn't the silence, but the smell. Not of smoke or decay, not yet, but something sweeter, sickly, like mold mixed with wet hay and forgotten fruit left to spoil in the corners of cellar. The buildings stood intact at a distance, their outlines undisturbed beneath the gray sky. But as we stepped closer, the illusion cracked. Doors hung off hinges. Shutters creaked in the wind, and the snow that had blanketed the roofs had melted in strange, uneven patches, revealing what blackened by old fire. My men didn't say a word. They'd seen ruins before. But this was different. There were no shell holes, no craters, no impact zones. Just the remains of something that had burned slow and quietly, without a fight, like the village had chosen to die instead of be taken. Behind the church, we found the first trace of who had lived here, or tried to. A single boot, child-sized, half-frozen in the mud near a trough. No footprints. No tracks. Just a boot, pointed toward the forest, as if it had been placed there for someone to find. Muller took a few steps forward, but stopped as his foot broke through a layer of ice and sunk into the soil beneath. He cursed, pulled back, and looked at me. I didn't need to say anything. We moved on. Behind the smithy, a set of pliers lay on the anvil, rusted stiff. The horseshoe beneath it had been nailed to the iron surface, not with craftsmanship, but desperation. Each nail driven at a wild angle, as if someone had tried to seal something shut. In what had once been a schoolhouse, we found desks turned against the wall, piled high with coats and satchels, as if the children had all been told to undress before fleeing, or worse, before hiding. The blackboard still had faint chalk lines, math problems left unfinished. A pile of melted wax beneath the teacher's desk told us someone had tried to make light, even after the electricity went. But there were no bodies, no ash piles, just the things people leave behind when they believe they'll return. We split into pairs to check the houses. I went with Richter down a side street where the snow had settled more heavily, untouched by prints or tires. The house we entered had been a bakery. The scent of yeast still clung faintly to the beams, competing with that same rotweed smell at the edge of the village. Inside, the air was warmer, too warm. Our breath didn't show. There was no fire, no stove, yet the chill on our coats melted instantly. It felt like stepping into a memory, but not one of ours. The walls had been scratched, not carved. Scratched, dozens, maybe hundreds of lines, chaotic, overlapping, climbing toward the ceiling like someone had tried to climb out through the very wood. In the center of the room, an oven door stood open. Inside, a child's doll lay half-burned, arms stretched as if reaching for something. Not a toy placed in fear. A sacrifice, maybe, or a warning. We didn't speak of it. Outside, Richter lit a cigarette with shaking hands and said nothing. Across the street, Meyer and Gross returned from their search. They'd found a root cellar beneath one of the homes, stocked but untouched. Cans of pickled cabbage, smoked meats, jars of jam, all sealed, all still edible. But on the floor above, someone had written, "Do not eat," in charcoal across the pantry door. Beneath the cellar hatch, scratched into the wood in a child's hand, one word repeated over and over: "Stay." We regrouped in the chapel. The bell tower had collapsed inward, crushing the pews beneath a heap of stone and snow. The altar remained, but the crucifix had been removed. Not stolen. Removed. There were clean indentations in the wood where the nails had been pulled straight out, no splintering. On the back wall, someone had drawn a door in black ink, just a rectangle, no knob, no hinges, and from its bottom edge, the ink had dripped long vertical trails that didn't fade with time or snowmelt. They looked wet still. At the pulpit, we found a priest's robe, carefully folded, placed on the open Bible, but the pages had been torn out. All of them. Just the covers remained, spine still intact. I took first watch that night. We lit a fire in the bakery, but the heat didn't settle. The walls breathed cold. Each hour dragged like a blade against bone. Outside, the trees whisper without wind. Richter slept with his rifle across his chest. Gross murmured in his sleep, words I couldn't make out. And Meyer, he sat upright in the far corner, eyes fixed on the oven. I told him to get some rest. He didn't respond. When I looked again 10 minutes later, he was gone, just his coat and boots left behind, neatly placed by the hearth. I didn't wake the others. I couldn't say why. Some instinct older than orders, older than reason. I wrapped myself tighter in my blanket and stared into the fire, willing it to last the night. The wood cracked, hissed, and beneath the sound for a moment, I thought I heard the bell. Not the chapel bell, but something deeper, lower, not calling out, but warning. I told myself it was in my head. That Richter stories from the Polish front had poisoned my sleep, but the sound stayed, just under the crackle of the flames, a note that had no source. And once you heard it, you couldn't forget it. I sat there until dawn, eyes open, breath shallow, heart stubbornly pretending it hadn't changed its rhythm. And when the light came through the frost-stained glass, I looked at Meyer's coat again. A piece of paper stuck out from the pocket, not folded, just tucked in like someone wanted it found. It had only one line, scribbled in faint pencil, smudged by sweat or water. I read it once. Then again. He took off his boots to not make a sound. I didn't touch them. I didn't speak. I just watched the snow outside begin to fall again, heavier this time, like it wanted to cover everything before night came once more. And for the first time since we'd arrived, I began to hope that the road back had truly vanished, that maybe we were meant to stay, because whatever we'd entered, it didn't like to be left behind. At first light, we searched for Meyer, not because we believed he'd gone far, but because something in each of us demanded we pretend it was possible. The snow had fallen all night, but not evenly. Around the bakery, the ground lay covered in thick white drifts, soft and untouched. But 10 meters out near the schoolhouse, it flattened in unnatural patterns, circles and wide arcs, as though the wind had spun in one place for too long, or something had paced in a slow, patient loop. We didn't speak of the note. It stayed in my pocket, its graphite lines now etched behind my eyes. We fanned out in silence. Muller and Gross took the eastern edge, where the road dipped toward the frozen stream. Richter and I moved west, toward the tree-line where the church's shadow used to fall. The footprints began shallow, almost invisible under the new snow. But they were there, bare feet, 5 toes, human in shape, uneven in stride. They moved away from the bakery, toward the last row of houses we hadn't entered yet. We followed, rifles unslung but not raised. Every step forward felt heavier, not from fatigue, but from something we couldn't name. I wanted to call out to Meyer, to break the quiet that seemed to gather around our chests like tightening ropes, but the sound wouldn't rise. The houses here were different, older but less damaged. Their doors were shut, their windows intact, as if whatever had happened here had stopped short of touching them, or maybe they'd already been emptied before it all began. The footprints led to one house at the very end of the path, a squat wooden structure with moss on the roof, and a sagging chimney that coughed once as the wind passed. We pushed the door slowly. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air felt thick like the breath of something sleeping. The room was sparse, a cot, a stove, shelves with sealed jars. On the wall, above the cot, a single photograph. A family of 4, faces blur with time, but all facing the camera with eyes too focused for a casual portrait. At their feet, a dog with its head turned, staring away from the lens. The footprints ended beside the bed, and on it a dent, fresh, shallow, as if someone had sat there briefly, then stood. No blood, no sign of struggle, just a small smear on the pillow. Salt white, crystalline, like frost melted and dried again. We stepped back out. The prints didn't continue. No exit trail, no drag marks. Just that final step, and then silence. Mueller waved us over. Near the stream, they'd found something too. Not Meyer, not his coat or his rifle, but tracks, deep and wide. Not boots, not hooves, not even paws. 5 indents, splayed like a hand, each one as long as my forearm. They moved toward the village, not away. Only a few prints, but fresh, pressed deep, too heavy for a man, too narrow for any animal I'd seen. We followed them until they vanished beside the chapel's ruins. The snow around the altar had melted completely. The black door drawn on the wall was no longer dry. The ink had thickened, congealed, running down in slow, fresh rivulets. I touched it once. Cold, sticky, not paint, not charcoal, something older. Behind the altar, we found a trapdoor. We hadn't seen it before. It blended with the floor, covered in soot and broken plaster. But now it was open, not ajar, open, as if waiting. A ladder descended into blackness. We stood there, each of us pretending not to feel the pull beneath our feet, like gravity had changed direction slightly, urging us down instead of up. Gross stepped forward first. Said it might be a root cellar. That maybe Meyer had gone in on his own. I didn't believe him, and neither did he. But we needed a reason. So he went first, then Mueller, then Richter. I went last, closing the door behind me, not out of caution, but instinct. The descent wasn't long, but the ladder creaked as if it bore the weight of more than just 4 men. At the bottom, the air shifted. It didn't stink of mold or rot. It smelled sterile, like a hospital corridor long abandoned, but never quite emptied. The walls were stone, damp and smooth. The space opened into a narrow tunnel, carved cleanly, lit by no source yet visible enough to move without lamps. We walked. For how long, I can't say. There were no turns, no junctions, just one path, sloping ever so slightly downward. The temperature dropped, but the frost never returned. It was a different kind of cold, internal, the kind that made your joints ache and your thoughts slow. The silence followed, thick as water, until even our footsteps began to sound like echoes of something not our own. Then, without transition, the tunnel opened into a chamber, round, high ceiling, ringed with what looked like columns. At its center, a pedestal. Upon it, a shape, a bundle, cloth-wrapped. No dust, no decay. Mueller stepped forward first, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He reached for the cloth. I told him not to. He hesitated. And in that breath of stillness, we heard the bell. Not loud, not distant. Close. Below us or inside us, I couldn't say. A single toll. Then silence. Mueller turned to us, eyes wide, mouth open, but no words came out. His jaw moved, but no sound. His fingers trembled. Then he dropped to his knees. Behind us, the tunnel sealed. No sound, no collapse, just absence. Where the path had been, now there was only stone. Richter fired his rifle at the wall, a panic reflex, but the shot echoed once and was swallowed. No debris fell, no dent, just a markless surface that hadn't been there a moment before. The cloth on the pedestal began to move, not from wind, not from touch. From within, something shifted beneath it, slow and deliberate, like breath from lungs not meant to breathe. We backed away. The columns around the chamber were not columns. Not really. Close up they were statues, each one different, each one worn, but not with time, with touch. Their features blurred as if hands had pressed against them for centuries. Some had faces of men, some of women. Some had no faces at all, just smooth ovals where eyes and mouths should be, and at their feet, names carved deep in languages I didn't know. Except one. It said Meyer. Not painted, not etched, carved, perfectly. I turned to Gross. He stared blankly, whispering something to himself, over and over. "We're just late," he said. "We're just late." The cloth slid from the pedestal. What it revealed is not something I'll try to describe now, only that it looked back, and that the bell rang again to be why the fourth day. I could no longer tell which direction we had come from. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind had combed the ground into pale dunes that blurred all traces of our journey. The old barn we'd found shelter in the night before it collapsed during the storm. I could still see the broken slats in the distance, half buried now, like ribs poking out of a grave. I left it behind without looking back. Walking east, at least what I thought was east, I followed a thin line of telegraph poles that vanished and reappeared between the trees like a trail of uncertain memory. The wires had long since snapped, dangling like black veins across the sky, humming nothing. At midday, I found an edge of field that led to a forgotten structure, the kind I only remembered from before the war. Low stone walls, a slate roof missing entire sections, and a wooden door covered in moss. It was a train outpost once, a small relay station on the old route to Vilnius. The sign had fallen, but the rusted hinges still carried the shape of the letters. There were no tracks now, just wild roots and dry snow. Inside, it was warmer than I expected. The windows were intact, dust clinging to their edges, muting the light. The room smelled of mold and old rope. A few crates lay scattered near the back wall, some of them half open. Filled with papers and bent tin cups, a hat was hanging by the door, Soviet issue, but worn by time more than by battle. I didn't touch it. The silence wasn't empty. It felt like something had paused. Not left, just paused. I stepped carefully over a collapsed beam and found a side room that might have been an office. The desk inside still had its drawers. I opened the top one. Inside was a folded cloth with red embroidery, and beneath it, a stack of identification cards, some German, some Russian, and one Polish, all without photos, all stamped in the same month. I checked the date. February 1945. The same week we lost contact with the entire division south of Grodno. I sat down in the corner, letting my back lean against the cold brick. My boots were soaked through. I took one off and poured out melted snow. The toes were white and stinging. I wrapped them in cloth from the drawer. The embroidery looked handmade. Birds, stars, a crescent moon. Someone once cared for symbols like that. Someone had sewn them into something meant to keep another warm. I held the fabric tighter. Then I heard it above me, a dull thud. A second one. Slow, not violent, just steady. It came from the attic, or what remained of it. I waited, held my breath, and listened. After a minute, the sound stopped. I counted slowly to 100. Nothing. Then I stood up, climbed back to the hall, and found a ladder to the upper level. The hatch was open. I climbed slowly, rung by rung. It was creaking beneath my weight. The attic was narrow, dark, but dry. Only slivers of light cut through the holes in the roof. There were markings on the floor, lines drawn in chalk, smeared in some places, overwritten in others. At the far end, a blanket was laid out, and on it, a satchel closed tight. I moved toward it. A journal was tucked into the side pocket, worn and full. I opened it and flipped to the last page. It was written in Russian. My reading was poor, but I could still make out phrases. They said the train wouldn't come. We waited anyway. She spoke only once. Said the tracks were never meant to carry the living. Then a list of names. Dozens. No ranks, no ages, just names. Some crossed out, others repeated twice. I turned to leave, but something shifted beneath my boot. I looked down. A floorboard had bent slightly, revealing a small hollow. I crouched and pried it open. Inside was a photo, face down. When I turned it over, I saw a woman, middle-aged, eyes soft, headscarf tied neatly. The background was snow. Beside her, a young boy. They weren't posing. They were looking at something off camera, something that made the boy's mouth curve in fear. On the back, a note in Polish. If he comes, don't let him answer. No name, no date, just that. I put the photo back where it was and sealed the hatch. Downstairs, I packed my things. I didn't want to sleep there, not even with 4 walls around me. The sun had started to lower. The trees cast longer shadows now, stretched like reaching hands across the snow. I crossed the clearing quickly, back to the line of broken poles. I didn't look back until the relay station was completely out of view. Even then, I felt like it hadn't stayed behind. That night, I camped under an outcrop of rock on the edge of a frozen creek. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. But long after the stars came out, I still saw the flicker of that attic, the chalk markings, the quiet names, and the woman who never smiled for the camera. The night passed without sleep. The wind had changed sometime before dawn, no longer slicing through the trees like it had purpose, but circling instead, hovering just above the surface of the snow, as if it was listening. I kept my coat drawn tight, boots to the fireless embers, hand on the old revolver that had only 3 rounds left. The creek beside me, frozen for days, now groaned in slow pulses beneath its crust of ice. Not cracking, not melting, just shifting, like something beneath was pushing up, trying to reshape the surface. I moved before sunrise, avoiding the line of telegraph poles, and turning instead toward a ridge I'd seen in the distance the day before. It was higher ground, less dense in trees, and I hoped from the top I could see a path or smoke, or even just a break in the monotony of white and black. My breath came out in clouds that vanished too quickly. The air was colder now, but emptier too, like it wasn't just a temperature that had dropped, but the presence of the world itself. By midday, I reached the top of the ridge and looked out. No villages, no roads, but a structure, stone and wide, half buried in the side of the hill. A church or something older. The walls had collapsed on one end, and the roof sagged like a jaw unhinged, but the front door still stood, solid oak with iron bands, etched in a language I didn't recognize. I descended slowly, careful of the snowdrifts that swallowed whole trees in places. When I reached the base of the hill, I realized the air here was warmer, unnaturally so. My breath no longer steamed. The snow was thinner. The ice on the nearby rocks was slick, not brittle. The church or mausoleum or shrine, whatever it once was, sat in the middle of a shallow basin where no birds flew and no tracks led. I knocked once before pushing the door. It opened without sound, swinging inward on hinges that looked rusted but moved too easily. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and wax. Candles had been used recently. Their stubs were fresh, wax still soft. On the walls, faded frescoes showed scenes I couldn't place. Figures without faces, hands raised not in praise but in warning, eyes replaced by red smears that had run with time or intention. I moved down the central aisle, past broken pews and a lectern carved from dark wood, to an altar covered in cloth. The cloth was stained, but not with wine or dust. Beneath it, a shallow bowl of blackened water, and beside that, a bone carved with inscriptions so fine they looked like veins. I didn't touch anything. Behind the altar, steps descended into the earth. I stood at the top for a long time, waiting for a reason not to go down. But silence isn't permission or denial. It's just absence. I lit a small oil lamp from my pack and began to descend. The walls closed in quickly. Roots jutted from the ceiling like fingers. The stairs turned sharply, then ended in a corridor lined with alcoves, each one holding remnants of cloth, wood, rusted tools, or bones wrapped in linen. I passed a small room to my left. Inside, a table covered in open books, pages warped by moisture but legible. Names again, lists, annotations, a pattern of births and disappearances, all dated decades apart but repeating in clusters. Each cluster ended with a note written in thicker ink. He walks when they forget. In the back of the room, a map etched directly into the wall. No borders, no nations, just a web of points connected by lines, and one point circled and read over and over again. I recognized it, the relay station. I left the books where they were and continued deeper. The hallway ended in a stone arch sealed with wooden beams. Something had tried to claw through them. Deep gouges, symmetrical, not random like an animal. Beyond the beams, I could hear a sound, not a voice, not breathing, but the echo of motion, like footsteps played backward through a cracked speaker. I turned back, slowly, retracing my steps, each footprint already half faded as I passed. I climbed the stairs again, back into the sanctuary, but the air had changed. The candle wax was gone, the pews no longer broken, just dustless. On the altar, the cloth was clean, and the bowl full of clear water. Outside, the snow had returned, but softly, falling straight down without wind. I closed the door behind me and began walking toward the ridge again, but the path I'd taken was no longer there. The terrain was flatter, trees in different positions, the hill lower than before. I kept walking, not toward anything, but away from what I had seen. My legs ached. My hands had begun to tremble, not from cold, but from something else. I reached the creek again by nightfall, the same one I had camped beside, but the ice was different now. It was thicker, more opaque. I stepped closer and saw something beneath the surface, a trail of scratches etched into the ice, words written with broken fingernails or knives. The same phrase, repeated in a spiral. Don't remember him. He will find you if you remember. I backed away, slowly, until the creek was out of sight. The woods felt different now, less like a forest and more like a veil. Somewhere ahead, I thought I saw a light, just a flicker, but I didn't trust it. I kept moving anyway. Behind me, the sound of shifting ice continued, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging themselves just beneath the surface. I had walked for what felt like hours, even though the sky hadn't changed. Dusk seemed stuck between dirty blue and the gray of the clouds, as if time had been suspended by something that didn't understand the natural rules of the seasons. The trees seemed shorter now, their twisted branches bending at almost human angles, and the ground beneath my feet sank in a way that didn't feel like snow, but rather a layer of living, wet skin covering the earth. I tried to keep my focus on the horizon, but every 3 or 4 steps the terrain seemed to tilt slightly, as if I were walking over a mad compass. That's when I saw the pole. A single telegraph pole in the middle of nowhere, standing straight like a needle driven into the center of a wound. No wires, no lines connected, no other poles nearby. The number 17 painted in black on a rusted, crooked metal sign. As I approached, I noticed its base was embedded in the earth. It seemed to be growing out of the ground, slowly like an iron tree. The wood was strangely preserved. No moss, no signs of weathering. I ran my hand over it and felt that the pole was warm. Too warm. I recoiled instinctively. My body understood something my mind couldn't yet formulate. That object wasn't supposed to be there. Not now. Not like this. I backed away. But I couldn't stop looking. Behind the pole, the forest opened into a clearing where the ground was made of smooth, dark stone, like a forgotten plaza, hidden in the snow. At the center, a round iron hatch, with claw marks surrounding it. The trees stopped just short of reaching it, as if avoiding it with the same reverence animals show toward places marked by death. There was no wind, no sound, only a faint hum coming from the pole, almost imperceptible, yet constant, vibrating at the base of my skull like a memory trying to return. I stepped onto the stone, and the sound stopped. The hum ceased instantly, as if cut by a blade. The iron hatch had a circular inscription I didn't recognize. It wasn't Russian or German or Latin. It was like a visual echo of words that weren't meant to be read, only felt. I felt the pressure change. The air grew thick, as if it had weight. The pole behind me creaked. I turned just in time to see the sign with the number 17 sway by itself, without wind, spinning 1, 2, 3 times. Then stopping, pointing at me. That was enough. I ran. I ran like I hadn't since the first bombing in Kovel. I ran until my legs gave out, and the pain in my ribs reminded me I was still alive, even if trapped in something that didn't want me to remember that. I collapsed into a shallow ditch and covered myself with snow until the trembling passed. From inside, I heard footsteps, slow, deep, as if something large was circling the edge of the clearing, marking territory, waiting. The steps lasted a long time. When they stopped, The silence that followed was worse. A silence of waiting, of held breath. It took me hours to leave that ditch. Night had finally fallen, but the sky looked the same, trapped in faded tones, without stars, without moon. I walked again and realized I was going back. Without noticing, my legs were taking me toward the pole. But now there were more. A second pole, number 16, 500 meters ahead, number 15, all without wires, all with would warm to the touch. A corridor formed in silence, descending down the hill towards something my mind resisted accepting. I forced myself off their path, veering east, crossing uneven terrain and breaking dry branches that shouldn't have been there, since nothing in that forest seemed dead, only paused. After hours like that, I reached a cabin, a small structure made of stone and old wood. The door was slightly open. Inside, the smell of old hay and ashes, an extinguished fireplace, a bed without a mattress. On the floor, a journal. I opened it with trembling fingers. The first page read, "Don't look at the poles." They looked back. The others were written in the same hurried handwriting, long and confused paragraphs, mixing dates, names, places that seemed familiar but scrambled, as if someone had lived my steps before me, in a different order. One name appeared several times. Henrik. I never knew him, but he knew about the relay station. He knew about the iron hatch. He knew about the sequence of poles and the message they tried to transmit. A story not told with words, but with presence. Something that didn't want to be remembered, only felt. I closed the journal and burned one page in the fireplace just to see if it would still catch fire. It did, and with the flame came a sound muffled, distant, like a transmission intercepted by a dead radio. 3 short beeps. 2 long. 1 short. Silence. A whisper that wasn't allowed, but inside my chest. I stepped outside the cabin and looked back. Pole 17 was now visible from the door, and between it and me, there were footprints that weren't mine. The path narrowed into a corridor that hadn't been carved with utility in mind. It turned at uneven angles, sloped without reason, and sometimes bulged into alcoves that served no visible purpose. The air grew warmer the deeper they went, yet none of them dared to take off their jackets. It was a heat that felt wrong, not physical but symbolic, like entering the breath of something that should have long since exhaled its final sigh. Claude Bellin moved with care, every step measured, one hand gliding lightly along the wall, the other holding the battered torch whose glow he no longer trusted. The others followed close behind, but none of them spoke, not after what they'd seen in the room with no echo. The silence had become participant in their mission, an invisible presence that punctuated their breathing and slowed their pace. They came upon a small antechamber, walled in rust-colored stone, the floor uneven and covered in grit. In one corner sat a desk, half-rotted and buried beneath a collapsed section of piping. Bellin knelt slowly, brushing away the dust and rubble. Underneath lay a notebook, its cover blackened but intact, bound with a leather strap that had melted slightly into its surface. He opened it carefully. The pages looked blank, age-stained, brittle, but untouched by ink. It should have meant nothing. A decayed relic, discarded by a soldier too hurried or frightened to write. But Bellin paused. There was something about the way the paper shimmered, slightly when tilted toward the light, as if language had been there once and retreated. He pulled the lamp closer. It gave off more heat than the torch, and as the warmth touched the page, something began to emerge, lines, faint at first, then darkening like veins coming to the surface of a pale arm. Not ink, not charcoal, but a thermal reaction, maybe chemical, maybe deliberate. The others crowded around him now, watching the slow unfurling of invisible sentences. Bellin's pulse jumped. French, not perfect, but fluent and old. The script was curved, disciplined, unmistakably military. He read aloud, voice low. This place was never built for battle. It is a cathedral made to receive sound. We arrived with orders, but the orders changed. Now we write what we hear. Now we record what speaks. The next page bloomed more radically. Stains interfered. Fingerprints from years ago still visible in sweat-shaped arcs. The writer mentioned names, false ones, and then among them, a phrase Bellin had not heard since his training days. Operation Verb Muet. Silent verb, a French intelligence program, abandoned before the war truly began. Its purpose had always been obscure. Something to do with enemy signal interference, using phonetic mimicry to distort transmissions, but it had been shut down before any field test. Or so everyone believed. Another passage revealed something even more troubling. There had been subjects, people, volunteers at first, then not, exposed to sustained tones and frequency, ranges barely audible, kept in chambers where light and sound were modulated in precise intervals. Some wrote compulsively after exposure. Others stopped speaking entirely. One had torn out his own tongue, leaving only the words, "I heard myself," carved into his mattress with his nails. Bellin's hand trembled. He turned another page. More thermal script bled to the surface under the lamp's heat. This one was marked with a different hand, sharper and unbalanced. It didn't follow any format, just confessions, fragments, numbers. But one phrase appeared 3 times, each instance darker than the last. Chambre noire écoute toujours. The black room always listens. A chill climbed his spine, colder than anything the mountain's air had yet offered. The notebook was no longer a diary. It was a log of exposure, a record of voices not just heard, but implanted. One entry listed coordinates, followed by a notation. Source moved. Still active. Residual vocal imprint present. And then, at the bottom of the final page, something that stopped Bellin's breath. A name. H.M. Marcoux. Dated April 1943. A full year after man had supposedly vanished. Next to the name, only 4 words. I stayed. For him. Bellin closed the notebook slowly, almost reverently. The others looked to him for meaning, for interpretation, but none came. He slid the diary into his coat and stood, unsure his legs would support him. The heat hadn't lessened, and now it carried a hum. Faint, rhythmic, not mechanical, not from the pipes. It was coming from the walls. A resonance buried, so deep it didn't need volume to be felt. Bellin didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply turned toward the next corridor, the one line with lead shielding and rusted locks, and began to walk. The corridor curved downward, spiraling like the shell of some buried thing, narrowing in a way that forced him to walk single file, shoulders grazing the sweating walls. The floor was sloped just enough to force balance into a conscious act. Each step felt like a decision. The silence that had stalked him so far began to unravel, not into noise, but into pressure, a density in the air that pushed against eardrums and made even shallow breaths feel intrusive. Claude Bellin, now at the lead, carried a heat-reactive notebook inside his coat like a relic too sacred to expose again so soon. He no longer needed to read it. The words had already nested. There are things we do not forget because we were never allowed to remember them in the first place. He felt them now, like old dust stirred by footsteps in the sealed room. The others followed without conversation. Even the most skeptical among them had grown reverent or afraid. Those emotions often led to the same silence. It wasn't just the contents of the notebook that had shaken them. It was the way Bellin had read it aloud, as if he'd heard the words before, as if somehow they'd always been his. The tunnel ended not in a room but in a breach. A section of the wall had collapsed inward, revealing what seemed like an unfinished chamber, or perhaps a chamber deliberately concealed. No supports, no signage, just rough concrete leading into a dome-like space with walls that shimmered slightly, coated in a fine crystalline frost despite the warmth that had followed them this far. Bellin stepped inside first. Scanning the curvature, the way sound behaved differently here. His boots made no echo. The others hesitated before entering, reluctant to disturb what felt like a room shaped for something more permanent than man. In the center stood a rusted podium with no purpose. No papers, no controls, no buttons, just a spool of magnetic tape housed in a cracked casing, its reels motionless, its ribbon tangled across the floor like the dried entrails of a machine too tired to die. Bellin crouched and touched the tape with gloved fingers. It stuck slightly as if fused to the ground. Carefully, he wound a section into the small manual reader one of the radio men carried in his pack. A museum piece, but functional. No one had expected to use it. No one had expected this place to still speak. The machine clicked once, then began to whir. At first, nothing, just static, faint as moth wings. Then, like someone clearing their throat in the dark, a voice emerged, not distorted, not aged, but clear, too clear, as if it hadn't traveled through tape at all. It was speaking French, and it was reading, slowly, deliberately. The rhythm was unmistakable to Belland. He froze, chest tight, breath thin. The others looked at him, then at the machine, unsure of the tone but aware of its weight. It was the opening of Le Soulier de Satin, the old play they had rehearsed as boys, in an attic above a church school in Avignon. Belland hadn't spoken those lines in decades, and yet here they were, spoken back to him, syllable by syllable, by a voice that once belonged to Etienne Marcoux. No one else recognized it. To them, it was just a Frenchman reading poetry. But to Belland, every vowel landed like a nail driven through memory. Etienne had not just been his friend. He had been his tether to a world before silence, before war, before men started measuring each other by the things they'd had to survive. Hearing that voice again here, in this tomb of echoes, was not a gift. It was an accusation. He felt his knees weaken, the weight of something collapsing inward. The others saw it, but said nothing. What could they say? There are moments when reality folds on itself like damp paper, when no interpretation is required. Because every part of your body already knows the truth before your mind can accept it. The tape continued. The same lines, repeated now, but slower, drawn out, like the speaker had forgotten how to finish. Then a pause. Then something new. A whisper, broken and wet. Not French. Not any language that should be spoken by a human throat. But Belland heard it nonetheless. He heard his name. Not shouted. Not pleaded. Just said, like a reminder. Like a breath exhaled too late. One of the soldiers swore and stepped back, his skin pale. The reader's reel stopped turning. The ribbon had snapped. Belland stood, his face unreadable, eyes still fixed on the broken machine. He didn't ask the others if they heard it. He didn't need to. The fear was plain now. It had reached them. Not the supernatural kind. The real one. The kind that follows when something impossible becomes undeniable. They left the chamber in silence. As they re-entered the corridor, the warmth returned, but now it felt like breath on the back of the neck. Belland didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it was almost himself. He stayed behind. He chose to. The soldier nearest to him, a younger man with a shaking lamp, asked quietly, "Chose to what?" Belland didn't answer, because the words felt too final, because the question already had its answer hidden inside it, because no one who listens that long to a voice without a throat ever truly walks away unchanged. They walk without direction, but not without destination. Each step followed a previous silence. Each corner promised nothing, and yet delivered less. Belland no longer led by position, but by gravity. The others orbiting his quiet urgency. Their own will surrendered not to rank, but to the inevitability of the path they were on. The tunnel had changed since the last chamber. The architecture subtly warped. The symmetry dissolved. Walls bent without angle. Lights flickered in a pattern that didn't feel accidental. Something ahead was guiding them, or perhaps constraining them. Not with force, but with familiarity. As if the structure had started to remember them, and began to mold itself in response. The notebook stayed folded in Belland's breast pocket, but its contents bled through him, turning every step into a continuation of a sentence he hadn't finished reading. The entries had spoken of a room without echoes, a voice trapped in stone, and finally, of something sealed by choice. The last few pages had contained no map, but a description written in layered ink, one message atop another, decipherable only through heat and memory. The key is not a door. It is what keeps it closed. He had thought that meant the voice. But now he began to understand. It meant the listener. The door only remains sealed as long as the listener refuses to answer. The passage widened gradually until it opened into a vault. The room was vast but imperfect, as though it had been dug in haste or deliberately left unfinished. Cables hung like veins from the ceiling. Racks of ancient equipment lined the walls, their functions long obsolete or never documented. In the center stood a structure like an altar, built from steel and stone, its surface engraved with overlapping scripts, Latin, German, French. One phrase repeated across each language, He who answers stays. No hindis, no seams, just a block, humming faintly with a warmth that made their teeth ache and their skin itch. Belland approached it, while the others hesitated at the threshold. His hand rested gently on the surface. It pulsed, not mechanically, not with electricity, but biologically, as if beneath the structure something was alive, or remember how to be. He looked at the symbols, read them aloud in whispers that made the others shift uncomfortably, not because of what he said, but because it seemed to summon the weight of a language that didn't want to be spoken here. The warmth increased. Beneath his fingers, the stone grew soft, or perhaps his nerves simply stopped trusting themselves. The recorder, still hanging to his belt, clicked without prompt, then played, the same voice as before, Etienne's. But this time, it wasn't a performance. It was a farewell. He spoke not to the microphone, but to the chamber, to whoever might find it. He spoke of frequencies that weren't sound, of experiments that weren't meant to be science, of a final request made by men who no longer remember their own names. I stayed, the voice said, because the question was never if we could lock it away. The question was if we were willing to stand beside it, alone, so no one else would ever open the door thinking they could carry what they found. The voice paused, then changed, warped, not into static, but into two voices layered on top of each other. One was Etienne's. The other wasn't. Belland turned to the others and said very quietly, "This is a key." No one asked what he meant. Some stepped back. One of the younger soldiers crossed himself and turned away entirely. Belland removed the notebook from his pocket and placed it atop the stone altar. The structure pulsed once more, brighter, warmer, then still. He reached for the recorder and pressed stop. Then he looked at the far wall, where a small slit of light, no wider than a finger, had begun to glow. It wasn't a door, but it was an answer. He moved toward it. One of the soldiers called out, but Belland raised a hand. He didn't look back, because the silence behind him wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory, and it had waited long enough. The slit of light did not expand, nor did it open to reveal a hidden passage or stair. It simply pulsed, rhythmic, silent, indifferent. Belland stood before it with the recorder still in his hand, though it had gone quiet again. Around him, the others remained frozen near the archway, unwilling to step further. They had seen enough to understand that they were not at the edge of discovery, but at the mouth of something that had already claimed too many names, too many echoes. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the folded letter Etienne had once written, the one he had kept with him since Paris, the ink now smudged, the paper soft from years of hidden grief. It no longer needed to be read. It had done its part. It had guided him to the last place where words still mattered. He laid it beside the notebook on the warm surface of the altar and turned back to the chamber. The glow grew fainter, not because the light was dying, but because a decision had to be made. It had waited long enough, and now it asked, would someone stay? Would someone become the silence that held back the question? Belland exhaled slowly. His body ached, not with age, but with the weight of understanding. He was not meant to escape this place, not because it was a trap, but because it was an answer in need of a keeper. He turned to the soldiers who had followed him this far and spoke with the calmness of a man who had remembered everything he had once tried to forget. You will return the way we came. You will seal the entrance with the charges left near the breach. You will tell no one what you saw, not because it's secret, but because it can't be carried. One of them protested, but Belland shook his head. This was never a mission. This was a promise. He walked with firm steps to the rear of the chamber where the light was brightest, now flickering like a breath. A terminal panel blinked to life beside it, ancient, analog, yet unmistakably active. He placed the recorder inside a recessed slot. It clicked. A tone followed. Then a low hum spread across the floor, like ripples through a frozen lake. The pulse moved upward, not outward, and the walls responded. Cracks formed not as destruction, but as reconfiguration. The chamber did not collapse. It reshaped itself. Corridors behind the soldiers began to vanish, replaced by walls where there had been openings. Ceilings lowered. The air grew dense. The chamber was closing not as a trap, but as a tomb for memory, for frequency. for silence. Bellin stepped into the light. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, warm, familiar, like the quiet that follows when someone stops asking questions they're not meant to answer. He didn't speak again. His body dissolved into silhouette, then into shadow, then into nothing. Above them, as the soldiers scrambled back toward the surface, the tunnels whispered their final instruction, a last breath of static, caught on one of the radios before it too went dark. A single line, etched into the static like a scar on vinyl. The silence holds, as long as we do. When they reached the entrance, dawn had begun to bleed over the Surat range. The wind was gentle. The debris from earlier tremors had covered part of the entry path, but not enough to block escape. They climbed with more urgency than skill, hands scraping stone, boots slipping on frost. When the last man surfaced, he turned back, but there was no tunnel, no gate, just rock, as if nothing had ever been there. They never found Bellin's body, nor the notebook, nor the letter. Only the silence remained, and beneath it, whatever had waited to be heard now had someone to listen for eternity. The official report was redacted before it ever reached command. The operation was classified as a navigational error. During terrain mapping, losses, 1. Cause, unknown. But the last man who left that mountain never forgot what he'd heard just before the cave sealed for good. À whisper in French, voir ma brise against the earth. Et si personne ne garde la porte, qui fermera la voie? And for the rest of his life, he never answered. They said the war was nearly over, that the Russians were flooding through the plains, and the Wehrmacht was breaking like thawing ice. But standing on the frostbitten road beyond Estegom, knee-deep in the ash-gray snow, and listening to the distant moan of artillery, nothing felt finished. My name is Elias Novak. I was born in Debrecen, but I no longer called it home. Home had become a word for men with clean hands and quiet sleep, and neither belonged to me anymore. When I joined the Royal Hungarian Army in 1942, I was still a butcher's apprentice, barely old enough to grow a beard. Now I wore a patchwork uniform with Soviet gloves, German boots, and a pistol stolen from a dead Italian officer. The things I had done had bled the innocence from my skin, and even my reflection didn't answer to my name anymore. Our unit was fractured, retreating westward without orders. What remained of the 11th Infantry Battalion had splintered after Soviet tanks breached the Danube lines. Half the men deserted. A third froze. Those of us who still walked did so with hollow eyes and unspoken promises to no one. Captain Rakatsi had been dead 3 days when I found myself leading the group, not by rank, but by the simple fact that I still moved when others stopped. We were 8 at that point, trudging west toward Kamram, hoping to reach German lines before the Russians caught up. But the wind had changed. It carried smoke, old gunpowder, and something stranger, a scent that reminded me of the slaughterhouse. Not blood, but something deeper, raw, hidden beneath the earth. It was around noon when we came upon the village. No signposts, no fences. Just 4 stone buildings buried beneath snow and time. One had collapsed entirely. The other stood as hollow shells. Yet smoke curled faintly from a chimney, a ribbon too deliberate to be the wind's. We hesitated, circling the edge like wolves uncertain if the prey was already dead. My friend Ballant, a former railway inspector turned rifleman, raised his binoculars and whispered, "Someone's alive in there." We approached cautiously. I held my breath, revolver drawn, boots sinking silently into the slush. At the doorway of the last house, I found a boot print too fresh to be more than an hour old. Inside it was warm, not from fire, there was none, but from something unseen. The walls bore marks, not from war, but from inside hands. Scratches on the plaster, as if someone had tried to climb out from the very foundation. In the corner, a cot with blankets folded too neatly. On the table, a bowl of cold soup untouched. And beside it, a journal bound in leather with the name L. Hurton pressed into the cover. I flipped it open. No narrative, no dates, just phrases. Each entry a murmur. They come tonight, but not for food. The floor hums when the sky is clear. Don't listen to the well. I closed it and slid it into my coat. We searched the rest of the village. Nothing. No livestock. No furniture moved in years. But in the cellar of the largest house, we found something else. A metal hatch, bolted shut from the outside. The air above it felt wrong, too still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. "We should leave," Istvan muttered, his voice thin. He'd once been a schoolteacher. Now he trembled like a leaf too tired to fall. But I couldn't, not after reading those words. Something about the way they were written, like someone begging across time. That night, we camped in the ruins. I took first watch. The wind had gone quiet, and so had the men. Balin snored softly, and Istvan clutched a Bible he hadn't opened in months. I stared at the hatch, the journal heavy in my coat. Hours passed. The moon sank. And then, from beneath the ground, a noise, not a voice, not exactly, but something shaped like one. A rhythm, a syllable. My name. I gripped my pistol, heart pounding. No one else stirred. I stood, boots crunching softly, and stepped closer to the hatch. The metal was cold. The bolts rusted but firm. But the sound, it grew clearer. Not louder, just sharper, like something finally remembered how to speak. I pressed my ear to it. Silence. Then a whisper, unmistakable now. "Elias." I staggered back. My pistol slipped from my hand and buried itself in the snow. No one moved. The world was still, but the silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like bait, the kind that waits patiently for you to lean too close. In the morning, the hatch was ajar. We hadn't heard it open. No footprints in the snow. Just a new page in the journal on the table. You opened nothing. It opened you. That was the moment I stopped believing we were just running from Russians. Some wars end in gunfire. Others begin in whispers. And the ones that whisper your name are the hardest to survive. We didn't speak about the hatch. Not directly. But it hung there between us, like a fog only I could see clearly. The others noticed something had changed. Balin kept glancing at me, expecting orders I no longer gave. Istvan prayed with his eyes open. The rest watched the horizon with rifles half raised, as if it was no longer just the Soviets we feared, but something without uniforms, something without rules. I didn't tell them about the whisper. I told myself it might have been a dream, a memory rattling loose from the back of my skull. But when I checked the journal again, the page with a new message was still there. No ink, just burnt ash trace into the paper, smudged like it had been written with a finger dipped in soot. We left the village before noon. The road to Kamram had vanished beneath a storm. Visibility dropped to nothing. I led them southwest by instinct, not compass. Mine had cracked in the cold. The forest was quieter than it should have been. No birds. No wind. The snow fell straight down like it was being pulled. After 3 hours, we reached a field where old tank treads had once crossed. There, rising from the white, like a tooth too long buried, stood a chapel. Half collapsed, crooked spire, wooden door swung open. We needed shelter. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if time pressed down in here harder than the snow outside. The pews were intact, but scattered, like someone had tried to form a barricade and gave up halfway. A single candle burned in front of the altar, and no one claimed to have lit it. On the stone floor by the pulpit, we found the first mark. It wasn't a footprint. It was a symbol, circular, about the size of a helmet, drawn in something black. Not coal, not paint. We didn't touch it. Istvan muttered something about old rites. Pre-Christian, perhaps, though even he didn't seem to believe the words as he said them. There was something carved into the altar, nearly invisible in the dim light. I rubbed away some of the frost and read aloud. He went down singing and rose without a face. No one spoke. We set up a fire using broken benches and some cloth. The snow outside thickened until it sealed the doorway. That night, one of our youngest Ferens, barely 20, vanished. His boots, coat, and rifle remained near the fire. His body heat hadn't even faded from the earth. No footsteps, no signs of struggle. Just a smear on the ground near the pulpit, shaped like handwriting. As I leaned down to examine it, I saw the smear wasn't blood. It was the same ash as the journal, but it spelled nothing. Not in a language I knew, just shapes, twisted, like script remembered by someone who had forgotten how to read. Ballant wanted to leave at first light, but the snow hadn't stopped. We couldn't open the door. That night, a voice echoed from the steeple. None of us moved to check it, not after what happened to Ference. I sat with a journal in my lap, staring at the last page. It had changed again. This time it said, "You walked into the quiet," but it did not end behind you. When we finally forced the door open on the third morning, the snow had stopped but left behind no trail, no horizon, no sun, just an endless gray, like walking through breath held too long. We marched in silence. For hours, I thought I saw someone moving beside us in the trees, always just out of reach. When I looked back, they were gone. Then I noticed something worse. The number of boot prints in the snow didn't match our number. There was always one extra. That evening we found a barn. No animals, but a fire still smoldering in the hearth. And inside, hanging from the rafters, a coat that had once belonged to Captain Ricazzi. I had buried it myself outside Vac, saw his eyes frozen open. Yet here was his coat, folded neatly, pockets still containing his cigarettes, and the field map he never let go of. The map had changed. It no longer showed roads or bridges, just one long black line curling through the hills, ending in a symbol I recognized from the chapel. I flipped it over. Someone had written in red ink a single sentence in French. Le silence n'est pas l'absence du son. C'est le retour du non oublié. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the return of the forgotten name. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the trees, and I waited for the whisper again. The snowfall stopped some time before dawn, but none of us noticed. It wasn't the light that woke me. It was the absence of it, as if even the morning had forgotten how to rise in that part of Hungary. The barn door stood ajar, though we had sealed it shut from the inside with rope and nails. The footprints of snow outside were undisturbed, yet the door was open wide enough for a man to pass through, or something quieter. We gathered our things quickly. No one questioned who had taken last watch. No one admitted to sleeping. Istvan crossed himself 3 times before stepping out into the pale gray. I left last, holding the map that had no names, only a curling black path like a coiled vein through the countryside. We moved without discussion. The trail led north, deeper into the woods, then veered sharply along a ridge that offered no shelter. A dozen trees stood snapped at the midpoint, not fallen by storm or rot, splintered clean, as if by pressure from above. The further we followed the line on the map, the less the world around us seemed to match anything remembered. Rivers flowed in silence. Birds flew without sound. Even the rifles on our backs felt heavier, as though weighed down by a memory they had yet to make. I tried to mark our progress in the journal, but the pen left no mark on the page. Only when I held it near the fire that night did I see faint impressions, words written, but hidden until warmed. Beneath the flickering orange, I read, "The ones who listen too closely begin to hum." We reached what should have been an abandoned checkpoint on the edge of Comram County. Instead, we found a small stone house buried in frost, intact but without doors. Inside, the furniture was arranged as if someone had just left. Teacups set out, a coat over the back of a chair, a radio still humming low static. No power lines led to the house. No chimney. The fireplace held no ash, but the stones were warm. On the wall, drawn in chalk, was the outline of a face, childlike in its simplicity. Yet the proportions were wrong. No mouth. The eyes, too, close together. Someone had scrawled around it, repeating the same phrase in at least 4 languages. "Don't let the silence hear your name." Ballant refused to sleep inside. He stood watch at the edge of the tree line, rifle slung, but never raised. I saw his breath hitch each time the wind changed direction. Inside, I opened a notebook again and found a new entry not in my hand. A message, small and narrow at the bottom of a page I had never turned. "The one who wore your coat remembers your voice." I looked down. The coat was mine, but I had found it in the chapel, hadn't I? Or was it already mine before the war? That night, Istvan broke. He didn't scream. He didn't weep. He simply began to walk into the woods with nothing but his rosary. I chased him down, shouting. He turned, looked at me with eyes I barely recognized, and whispered, "He's not sleeping. He's rehearsing." I asked who. He just pointed upward, not to the sky, but to a point above the trees where there was nothing. Nothing except that strange, unblinking stillness that seemed to press down on us more with each passing hour. We bound his hands gently that night, more for his safety than our peace. Still, I heard him murmur in his sleep, "Etienne, arrête the chanter. Tu n'es plus là." Etienne stopped singing. "You're no longer here." The next morning, the trail on the map ended, but the line continued in the real world. A narrow path through a marshy lowland led to the mouth of a tunnel built into the base of a hill, unmarked, untouched, its entrance sealed by a wooden gate carved with a date that hadn't happened yet, 1953. We stood there for hours, none of us willing to speak first. The frost on the gate didn't melt, even when touched. Finally, I stepped forward and pressed my palm against the wood. The gate opened inward without sound. Inside was not darkness, but a dim yellow light, flickering like candlelight but without flame. The walls were polished metal, not steel, not iron. The floor was dry, the air warm. Far in the distance, a voice played from a speaker. Faint, warped, French. "Écoute mes Caudeline, walk forward. Vous souvenez-vous de cette chanson, Claude?" "Do you remember this song, Claude?" No one else reacted. Only I had heard it. Only I remembered the melody. I didn't step further at first. The others had seen the same tunnel, the same metallic walls, the same false light pulsing like a heartbeat slowed by something ancient. But none of them looked up as I did. None of them froze when that voice drifted from a hidden speaker above, bent by distance and decay, and asked me by name if I remembered the song. It wasn't paranoia that curled my stomach. It was certainty. I did remember the melody. From a wooden hall outside Lyon, from the summer before the war, from Etienne's mouth, when we sang to stay awake after our last rehearsal. And yet, that voice should not have reached here. Not through soil. Not through decades. Not through death. They followed me because they believed I had a better sense of direction. But I didn't. I only had the ache of familiarity. I moved not by compass, but by memory. The tunnel grew tighter, sloped downward, split into branches that returned to each other like a coiled loop, as if the engineers had no destination, only an obsession with symmetry. At times, the lights above flickered in rhythm with our breath. Other times, they dimmed as if exhaling when no one did. The floor beneath us was seamless, no panels, no bolts, just the smoothness of metal worn not by feet, but by time. It felt alive beneath our soles. The speaker's voice returned every 100 meters or so. Each time, the same question. "Do you remember the song?" Each time, less like a voice, more like a recording played backwards and forwards again. I didn't answer. Not aloud. But inside, the chorus echoed whether I wanted it or not. Istvan started humming, completely unaware, balanced stuffed cloth into his ears. Still, I caught him flinching when the walls spoke. We found a sealed room near what looked like a pressure hatch. It had no lock, only a round handle rusted to its base. I turned it slowly, expecting dust or machinery, but instead, I felt warmth behind the door. The room had no heat source, but it had furniture, carefully arranged, a bed with pressed sheets, a desk with fountain pen still wet, a phonograph in the corner, and beside it, a small crate of records, all unmarked, all black, but not vinyl, a different kind of material, softer, almost organic. I didn't want to touch them, but I did. The topmost disc was warm. I placed it on the turntable and lowered the arm. A moment of silence. Then a voice, not Etienne's, but mine. My voice. From years ago, reading the second act of Landon's Fate, Anne-Marie, word for word. A performance I had only given once. A rehearsal, never recorded, never published. But there it was. My inflection, my hesitation on line 6. My breath catching when I forgot the 7th. No one else in the room moved. They were still, frozen not by fear, but by the overwhelming unreality of what they heard. I ripped the needle from the record and stepped back. The warmth vanished. The lights dimmed. The walls groaned. The phonograph remained still, but something behind the mirror across the room did not. I moved closer. The mirror had no reflection, just faint shapes moving behind it, like shadows pressed against a sheet of ice. I saw outlines that shifted with the weight of memory, soldiers I had known, faces I hadn't seen since Vichy. Etienne, perhaps, but not as I remembered him, as something stretched, something left unfinished. We left the room, but not fast enough. The corridor outside had changed. What had once curved left now descended in a spiral. The map I'd drawn in my notebook was useless. The ink had bled across the pages like sweat. I held the book near my chest and felt it beat once. Not throb, beat, a pulse, faint but present. I opened it and found new words where none had been before. You recorded more than your voice. I didn't sleep that night. No one did. We camped in a circular chamber with no doors, only the corridor we entered through. In the center was a table carved from the same seamless metal. No tools could have shaped it, and yet, etched into the surface, were names. Names I knew, names only I could know. Officers from my unit in 1940. Civilians I had hidden. My sister, who never left Montpellier. And at the bottom, Etienne Belland, my surname, his first name. We were not brothers, not by blood, but the mountain believed we were, and the mountain remembered. Even when the world had forgotten, we awoke without waking. The chamber had no sense of time. Watches stopped. Breaths echoed longer than they should. I don't remember closing my eyes, yet I remember the dream, a room like the one we slept in, except colder, slightly wider, with radios stacked from floor to ceiling. Radios with no dials, just blinking lights and coils that pulsed like hearts sealed in glass. They spoke in tongues I hadn't heard since the war began. Some Russian, some French, others not language at all, but something mimicking it, something trying. I jolted awake with a start that never reached my limbs. My body was already upright, already moving. The others too, like we had answered a call, not spoken aloud. We descended further. The spiral corridor we'd found now led to something broader, a dome embedded within the rock. The ceiling was smooth as bone. Light came from no source, yet we saw everything in hues of silver and ash. In the center stood a control panel, ancient, mechanical, yet pristine, as if untouched by rust or age. Levers shaped like vertebrae, keys made of glass, and on the wall behind it, a screen, not a monitor, not even a window, just a surface that shifted as if it had once been liquid, frozen mid-breath. When Isman touched it, the surface rippled and showed an image, the same room we stood in, but we weren't there. Others were, soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms, an officer in SS black, and one man at the panel, unmarked, older, in a coat like mine. The image blurred, and now I stood at that panel, not physically, but on the screen, watching myself fumble with the controls. The others stepped back. I saw confusion in their eyes, but no one spoke. I reached out again, and the static that filled the air before, low, whispering, now surged into language. The walls spoke, not through speakers, through themselves, through every wire buried in concrete. Transmission cycle initiated. It said, in clipped German, then in French, then in something older. The same phrase repeated. Not an alert. A ritual. The static cracked, and the voice that followed was not German, not mine, not Etienne's. It was layered, as if every voice that had spoken in this room had been recorded into the walls themselves, looping, overlapping, climbing over one another like vines in a graveyard. The message made no sense, yet its cadence was unmistakable. Someone was asking to be remembered, not rescued, not found, just remembered. The lights dimmed, and for the first time since entering the dome, we felt cold, not external, but internal, as if our own memories were being exhaled. I stepped away from the panel. The screen went blank. The others looked to me, not for command, but for explanation. I had none, only a growing conviction that this was not a military installation. Not anymore. It had become something else. A receptacle, a collector of signals and souls. of memories spoken once and never forgotten. I opened my notebook and saw words scrawled in the margins, my handwriting, but not written by me. The voice is not in the radio. The radio is in the voice. We left the dome. Behind us, the static did not fade. It followed, not louder, but closer. The walls whispered as we passed. You were here before, they seemed to say. You brought this. At a junction we hadn't noticed before, we found a door without a handle. Just a speaker mounted above it, a tape recorder beside it, loaded with reel. Someone had left it ready to play. I pressed a switch. The reel turned. The voice that came forth was unmistakably Etienne's. Older, weary, but still Etienne. Claude, he said, this place is not what we thought. It is not a base. It is a boundary between what we remember and what remembers us. If you come, it means the seal failed. You must finish it. The reel ended with a long breath, as if even that memory had tired of itself. I pressed rewind. The tape resisted, then cracked, split down the middle like something inside had torn free. The door did not open, but the wall beside it shifted, only slightly, revealing a narrow crack, just wide enough for one person. Inside, a tunnel of pure darkness. No seams, no concrete, only shadow. And from that shadow, the same phrase, again and again, like a prayer. Do you remember the song? We didn't go further that night, but none of us slept, because each of us heard a different voice singing it back. We descended again, this time not by duty, but by pull, like gravity of memory, not mass. No orders passed between us. We carried no flashlights now, only the heat-glow lantern from Bell and Satchel, and even that flickered as if protesting what it lit the corridor beyond the cracked wall was too smooth to be built, too silent to be empty. The concrete gave way to something older, colder, yet seamless. The walls had no joints, no seams. They curved with the same symmetry as bone. Not a bunker, not even a tunnel. A passage made to remember the ones who walked it. We felt it in our teeth, in our ribs. A rhythm that didn't beat like a heart, but like breath. One long inhale stretched across decades. And the moment we stepped through, we were inhaled with it. Behind us, the wall closed, not with sound, but with finality. No click, no seal, just absence. We didn't speak of it. Couldn't. Each step echoed less than the one before, like our weight was being slowly rewritten. In the dim light, we saw markings, barely etched into the surface. Not paint, not carvings. Residue. Heat ghosts of hands that had leaned against the walls long ago. Palm prints stretched by fear or time, some overlapping like crowds trying to flee through stone. Bellin traced one absent-mindedly and whispered Etienne's name, not as a question, but as a tether. After an hour, or maybe a minute, for time here had no honesty, we reached another chamber. Smaller, circular. In its center stood a single chair, metallic, bolted to floor, with leather restraints decayed but still firm in shape. A radio console stood before it, but the wires had grown into the wall, or perhaps had always been part of it. The console still hummed. A low signal. Not Morse. Not frequency. Just a pulse, like a memory stuck mid-thought. Belland reached for the dial, but the sound stopped before he touched it, and a voice came, not from the speaker, but from behind us. Don't let him forget. We turned, rifles raised, but no one stood there, just a wall, just more heat shadow. But we had heard it, all of us, the same voice in our own language. Each soldier heard it in his mother tongue. Belland heard it in Etienne's. Istvan heard it in Hungarian. Even Torres, who hadn't spoken since the dome, mouthed something in Spanish. We looked at each other, not in fear, but in recognition. This place wasn't haunting us. It was speaking our language. Each of our memories was being used as a translator. The radio console blinked, and the screen behind it lit up not with images, but words. French, Latin, German, overlapping in a spiral that made the eyes lose focus. One sentence repeated between the layers, always visible no matter which word you try to follow. What is buried does not forget. Belland stepped forward. He removed the letter from his coat. the one Etienne had sent years before disappearing. He unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the creases remained like scars. He placed it on the console. Nothing happened. Then, from the walls, a static murmur, a voice reading it aloud. But not Etienne. Bellin, his own voice, reading a letter he swore he hadn't written. The contents were the same, but the phrasing slightly different. Warmer, more resigned. It ended with a line we hadn't seen before, even though Bellin checked it every morning since we arrived. If they find me, let them believe I stayed. If they hear me, tell them I chose silence. Torres dropped his rifle, not out of panic, but fatigue. His lips moved, whispering something to himself. Then he turned toward the hallway we had come through. But it was gone. No exit. No trace of entrance. The chair in the center of the room suddenly hissed, air escaping from no visible source. One of the straps twitched, not from air, from something pulling it tight. The console blinked again. A new message. Receiver active. Awaiting sender. Bellin stepped back. His eyes scanned the room, not for danger, but for meaning. He asked a question none of us could say aloud. Is it me? And the lights dimmed in answer. Not a yes, not a no, just dimmer, like memory beginning to fade. He turned to us, voice steady. We need to go deeper. If this is memory, then the core is where it hurts. Istvan shook his head, but followed. The rest of us did too, not because we believed, but because no one ever forgets what they almost remembered. We left the letter behind. But when we looked back one last time, the chair was occupied. No one had sat in it, but the straps were drawn. The stairs were not stairs anymore. They descended in slow, sloping curves, carved too precisely to be made by human tools, yet lacking any symmetry found in machine precision. It was as though memory itself had worn them down, not feet. Every step we took felt mirrored by another one far behind us, or beneath us, echoing from a direction that didn't exist. The air no longer carried dust. It carried weight, not of gravity, but of recollection. Like walking through the inside of a secret too old to be whispered. No one spoke. The silence wasn't oppressive. It was expectant, as if the walls, the light, even the distant murmur of forgotten machinery were listening. The corridor narrowed, then opened again into a vaulted room without doors. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, curved like ribs of a vast creature fossilized in thought. But the shelves were empty. No paper, no boxes, no documents. Just thin layers of black film, like soot frozen in lamplight. Bellin approached one and exhaled close to it. The heat from his breath made the layers shimmer, and beneath it, symbols flickered, maps, blueprints, handwritten notes, all vanishing again as his breath faded. We understood instantly. These archives weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be remembered, only in moments of warmth, of presence, a place where memory was the medium. Not ink, not sound. Bellin pulled his scarf down and whispered Etienne's name once more. A shelf responded. Just one. It hummed softly and pushed outward, revealing a single object nestled within. A canister, no larger than a camera reel, wrapped in cloth that hadn't decayed. He held it like it might dissolve. On its side, a tag in faded blue ink, echoed. Seulement si tu reviens seul. Listen, only if you return alone. No one spoke. No one reached to take it from him. We had already begun to understand the rules of this place. The archive remembered the living only in the shadows of the dead. Bellin tucked away without another word. In the far corner, Istvan pointed to another alcove. This one hadn't responded to breath or heat, but it pulsed, very faintly, not with electricity, but like a lung. Bellin stepped toward it, but this time Torres stopped him. He simply pointed at the floor. Boot prints, not ours, barely visible, like they'd been made in steam. They led into the alcove, but didn't return. We followed anyway, because fear had stopped being useful hours ago. Inside was not a room, but a device, or the memory of one. An enormous will lay embedded in the ground, half exposed, half submerged in black metal that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Symbols in concentric rings surrounded it, Latin, Slavic, French, Morse. In the center was a gap, like a keyhole not meant for metal. Bellin stared at it too long, and when we called his name, he didn't respond. He finally whispered, "Chamber Noir." We didn't ask how he knew. We didn't ask what it meant. The phrase had already entered our own memory, as if planted. One of the symbols in the outer ring pulsed softly. It was the only thing that moved. Bellin didn't touch it. He just breathed on it. It brightened, and the wheel groaned beneath the floor, like a leviathan turning in its sleep. A panel on the wall unfolded, revealing not a document, but a photograph burned into metal. 5 men in uniform, none of them Bellin, one of them Etienne, the others unknown. Each face had been marked with a scratch, save one. The man at the center, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-sentence. Below the image, an inscription etched in French, so it couldn't deviate in echoes. Those who listen become echoes. Torres reached the panel, but Bellin stopped him. "This isn't a warning," he said. "It's an instruction." He turned to us slowly. He wasn't trying to hide what happened here. He was trying to teach us how not to repeat it. That was when we noticed the air had changed. It wasn't heavier, it was warmer, like something remembered us too clearly. The wheel below our feet began to vibrate, not violently, like breath, a deep, slow breath. A voice echoed through the walls, not from speakers, but from the very concrete. "Etienne." We all heard it, spoken not as a call, but as a reply. We turned back toward the corridor. The exit was gone. In its place, more stairs. Descending, always descending. We understood. The archive had opened to us because we carried memories that matched its own. Now it wanted more. We were inside a memory that refused to forget, and the only way forward was to become part of it. There was no decision to be made. The steps had already begun, whether it was one of us or the corridor itself. We never knew, but the descent resumed as though it had never paused, as though we had simply blinked and now stood one level deeper. The architecture betrayed no logic. What was one stone became glass, then steel, then something like bone. Not metaphorical. Actual. Polished, porous, slightly curved with the grain of thing that had once been alive and massive and now lined the interior walls with a reverence that dared not name its source. The floor was warm in places and cold in others. The walls weeped moisture where light should have touched. But the lights were not bulbs, they were threads. Organic, like fibers woven from a thing that still breathed. Torres led now, not because we appointed him, but because he no longer feared the air. It had touched him, perhaps claimed him, and in that strange inverse of terror, made him bold. Bellin remained behind, near the middle. He held the canister like one holds a relic too sacred to wear, but too vital to discard. Isfin and I formed the tale, not out of caution, but because something had to notice if we began to disappear. Again, the path ahead was silent, save for a soft humming that rose and fell in patterns, like breath beneath static. We followed it as one might follow a lullaby sung from a dream, half remembered and slightly wrong. At the bottom, or what passed for a bottom, the corridor opened into a cylindrical chamber with no visible doors. In the center stood a chair. More accurately, a throne, not regal, but mechanical, wired into the walls by roots of copper and tendon. At its base, a plaque carved in French and German. "Ce n'est pas un machine. C'est un miroir." This is not a machine. This is a mirror. Bellin approached slowly. The chair pulsed in response, not alive, but aware. He didn't sit. He knelt before it, opened the cloth around the canister, and removed the tape. No one asked why. We had learned to let his instinct speak first. He placed the reel in a small recess beside the base. The walls responded instantly, not with light, but with sound. The hum sharpened into voice. Male, soft, familiar. Bellin's shoulders tensed, then dropped. "Nous avons tout enregistré, Claude." We recorded everything, Claude. The voice was Etienne's. Calm, rehearsed, not a message, but a confession. He spoke of a project beneath the Surratt, not Nazi, not Roman, but something older, co-opted by the Reich as they often did, masking ambition behind rituals. They had found ruins beneath the mountain, structures that predated Caesar. Inside, inscriptions in languages no archaeologist could decipher. The rite brought linguists, then sound engineers, then mystics, then bodies. By the time Etienne arrived, voluntarily or not, the place was already no longer about war. It was about memory, transmission, containment, echoes. Etienne's voice trembled only once, when it said, "Le son nous rappelle, même quand nous oublions." Sound remembers us, even when we forget. As the tape rolled on, the chair rose slightly, just a few centimeters, like something dormant adjusting itself. Then a soft click, a compartment opened. Inside, a book, leather-bound, fresh, with Bellin's name already burned into the spine. He didn't take it. He looked at it as one might look at an infant, awed, terrified, unwilling to break the spell. The voice ceased. The light from the thread lines dimmed, and the walls began to change. The room twisted, not spinning, but bending inward, as if the mountain had blinked. What was once behind us was now ahead. The entrance corridor now an exit. We hadn't moved. The place had. Torres touched the wall and pulled back. Blood. His fingers hadn't been cut. The wall had marked him. A handprint now bloomed on the surface, smudged but unmistakably his. He wiped it. It remained. Istvan murmured something in Hungarian. We asked him to translate. He shook his head. "It doesn't work in other languages," he said. And that was when we understood. We hadn't come to hear a message. We had come to become one. Bellin finally took the book. It pulsed once, as though acknowledging the bond. Then the threads along the walls retracted, revealing a new corridor ahead, identical in shape, but brighter. Lined not in bone, but in marble, aged and cracked, etched with names. We saw none of ours there, but there was space left to carve. There was no sound in the corridor ahead, no echoes, no breath. Not even a faint vibration of the wires we had grown accustomed to hearing. Only our footsteps broke the silence, and even they felt borrowed, as though the ground had memorized each step before we took it. The names on the walls shifted subtly with the light, carved deep into marble, so worn it looked almost soft. Some names were familiar, officers, places, battles long lost to official history, while others were not names at all but patterns, glyphs, repetitions of syllables that had no translation. Torres traced one with his finger. It shimmered, then returned to stone. "This one was mine," he whispered. He didn't mean the name. He meant the place. Whatever this corridor was, it remembered where we had been. Bellin held the book like it weighed more than paper. He hadn't opened it, not since the chair, not since the voice. But every few steps, he'd glance at it, as if expected to open itself and offer a new command. The further we walked, the less the corridor resembled anything architectural. The marble began to curve slightly, then arch. Above us, the ceiling lifted into a dome without transition. There had been no staircase, no slope, just a straight corridor that now towered over us like a basilica built inside a heartbeat. And in the center of this space, raised on a platform barely 2 feet high, was what looked like an altar or a speaker, or both. It wasn't made of metal, nor stone, nor any material I recognized. It looked like petrified ash, compacted into a perfect cylindrical pedestal, the surface etched with rings too precise for human hands. Resting on top was a box no larger than a loaf of bread. Wires trailed from its underside into the pedestal, and from there into the walls. The wires weren't attached. They were grown. Bellin stepped forward without hesitation. He placed the book beside the box. The moment the two touched, the room responded, not with movement or light, but with memory. We all felt it, like standing beneath the weight of someone else's life, like hearing your name in a language you never learned. The altar vibrated, then split open down the center. Inside, another tape, not magnetic, not marked, just black, flat, and humming. Istvan tried to step forward, but Belland raised a hand. "It's not for us," he said. "It's from them." "Them who?" Torres asked, but he already knew. We all did. The people whose names were never meant to be remembered. The ones who built the first echo chamber, the first silence amplifier, the first room that refused to forget. Etienne's voice returned then, not from the pedestal, but from the air itself. We turned, but there was no source. Just the sound, and the words we could never unhear. This is a final archive, the voice said. The one we seal beneath the seal, beneath the threshold, beneath the voice. If you hear this, you are already part of it. Bellin removed the black tape with reverence. He didn't ask if we should take it. He knew. There were no instructions, only understanding. He placed the tape inside his coat and turned to us. We leave now, he said, not because it's safe, but because we've heard enough. And just like that, the room folded again. This time, not violently, not with vertigo, but gently. A doorway appeared behind us, where there had been none. A familiar passage. Stone. Metal. Rushed. We stepped through and found ourselves back in the main corridor, the one with the iron plaque and the mirror chair, now dark and unmoving. The threads no longer glowed. The humming had ceased. Even the blood print on the wall had faded. We retraced our steps, past the photograph room, past the corridor of shifting walls. No tricks now, no illusions, only quiet. And when we emerged in the tunnel into the twilight of the Italian countryside, we weren't sure how many hours or days had passed. The trees looked older, the snow deeper, but the air felt lighter, almost empty. Behind us, the entrance to the tunnel was gone, not collapsed, not hidden, just not there, as if it had never been. And in Bellin's coat, the black tape pulsed faintly, as if remembering how to be heard. We didn't speak for hours after leaving the site. The silence had clung to us like frost, wrapping itself around every thought, every instinct, every attempt to name what we had just walked through. Bellin led the way with a resolve that didn't belong to any officer or soldier, but to someone who had seen too far into the dark and now carried something it could never let go of. We crossed fields that weren't marked on our return maps, stumbled over routes that hadn't been there when we arrived. Even the wind had changed, whispering in tones that reminded us of that room, the one with no echo, where the air itself had chosen to listen. At some point, Istvan asked if we should contact command. Bellin shook his head. "This isn't for them," he said. "It was never for them." When we reached the outpost we had departed from, a single Allied sergeant stood by the radio tower, confused by our reappearance. He said we'd been gone 2 days. But his eyes told us more. He didn't recognize the looks on our faces, or the man we brought back. Bellin had stopped being a translator the moment we stepped inside that tunnel. Now, whatever he was, it was beyond uniforms and reports. We were debriefed, or they tried. Bellin handed over none of the evidence. No photographs, no maps, not even the tape. He simply filed a report saying, "Objective compromised by collapse. No recoverable intelligence." And that was that. The army, hungry for structure and conclusion, accepted it. But the rest of us knew better. There had been something inside that place, and it had not stayed entirely behind. Torres began writing every night. Pages of symbols, none of them coherent, as though the only way to relieve the pressure behind his eyes was to unload fragments of a language he no longer remembered learning. Istvan stopped speaking altogether. He communicated in looks and hand gestures, then eventually vanished from the barracks. The last I heard, he crossed into the mountains and never returned. I tried to forget. I drank. I burned the clothes I wore in the tunnels. But sometimes at night, I heard the echo return. Not loud, not violent, just enough to remind me the silence hadn't forgotten me. Bellin was the last to go. One evening, without word, he left the base and walked south. Someone said they saw him near the ruins of a Roman outpost, talking to no one, his hand resting over the pocket where the tape had once been. A week later, a package arrived at our old quarters. Inside, the book, the map, clean now, no ink or burns, and a note in French. It said, "If it ever calls you back, don't follow." We buried the book under a tree behind the barracks. None of us dared read it again. The next spring, I returned home. The war was still dragging its feet across the continent. But for me, something had already ended. Not just belief in command or purpose, but in the idea that war only takes place between men. I think about Bellin sometimes. not as an officer, not as a translator, but as a man who entered the silence willingly and never came back the same. He went looking for a friend, for a name, for something that history had crossed out, and in doing so, he became the final entry in a story none of us were supposed to hear. No map will show what we found beneath Monty Surratt. No report will file the voices, the hallways, the tape that whispered even when the machines were off. But I carry it still in the way I hesitate before listening to an old radio, or why I avoid tunnels altogether. Because beneath that silence wasn't nothing. It was memory. And memory, once it learns how to speak, never truly stops. And if you hear it, if you feel the pull again, if a voice without breath finds your name and calls you by it, walk away. The silence already chose, and it chose him. The marshes east of Breskins were supposed to be empty. That was a word carried by 2 runners and stamped across 3 field reports. Canadian scouts had pushed to the dike lines at dawn and met only pockets of retreating fire. A map drawn in pencil showed a cluster of low farmhouses and thin woodlands stretching toward the Leopold Canal. There were no markings past the canal, just a pale smear where the fog thickened. Sergeant Michael Rennick, 38, didn't trust maps with outlines. He'd been fighting since Dieppe and had seen too many paths marked clear turn into graveyards before the ink had dried. His boots sank half an inch into the soil as he stepped off the truck. The others followed, 5 in all, their faces wrapped in scars more for silence than warmth. Fog pressed against their helmets like a second skin, and the morning sun was a dull smudge above the trees. The air tasted metallic, as if something had burned hours ago and the ashes had never settled. They were ordered to make contact with missing patrol, a unit that had failed to report in after crossing the canal 2 nights earlier. Intelligence assumed they'd hold up due to weather or equipment failure. Rennick didn't speak much as they moved. His mind held tight to the last voice on the radio from that patrol. It had ended with a breath. No call sign, no static, just a breath. They passed the husks of 2 barns swallowed in frost. The wood sagged like it had grown tired of standing. Inside one, a rusted milk pail swayed slightly from a beam despite the still air. They didn't stop. Visibility was low, but the path, if it could be called that, kept a faint shape between the trees, bordered by reeds that leaned in like silent witnesses. Rennick checked his compass twice. North veer to east, east back to north, and then the needle still without reason. He pocketed it and kept walking. One of the privates, Dawson, pointed to something near the waterline, a helmet, half submerged, caught in a net of roots. No insignia, no blood, just stillness. They crossed the canal by plank, not the bridge, which had collapsed into the water weeks ago. The fog thickened on the other side. Sound changed there. Boots no longer crunched on leaves, but sank into something soft and shifting. Branches overhead grew heavier, as if soaked in something denser than rain. Rennick heard whispers, but not words. The kind of sound trees made in the wind when no wind was present. They found the first sign of the missing unit, near a flooded ditch. A ration tin, then a glove, then the burnt outline of a signal flare, spent but never fired. No footprints, no drag marks. The ground refused to remember anything. As they moved deeper, time lost shape. Watches read different hours. One private, Keene, whispered that he kept hearing someone behind them. They stopped, turned, and saw nothing. But the sense of being watched grew. It didn't press down like fear. It pulled gently like a tide. They reached what the map had called a communication station. It was not a station. It was a single building sunk halfway into the marsh, with a collapsed roof and no windows. The door had been wedged open with a bayonet. Inside, a radio lay cracked open. No call sign, no frequency. But the last message was carved into the wood frame. Not written, carved. No fire beyond the fog. Rennick stared at it longer than the others. He knew those words. Heard them once from a Polish sapper outside, who swore the Germans used fog as cover for something else. Something they didn't log, didn't name. That sapper had vanished the next night. Rennick didn't say this out loud. He only nodded and signaled for a sweep. They circled the structure and found more debris, empty packs, a broken lens, 3 shell casings, all unfired. Beyond the tree line, The fog shimmered strangely. Shapes moved in it, but when rifles raised, they were gone. The soldiers began to murmur among themselves. One claimed the fog was humming. Another swore the trees were breathing. Rennick dismissed them all with a look. But inside, a memory stirred. Something from his childhood. A story his grandmother told about forests that swallowed voices and returned only echoes. They camped inside the ruin. No fire, no light, just bodies close together and the weight of stillness. That night, Rennick dreamed of boots walking on water and a door that opened without hinges. When he woke, Keene was missing. No sound, no struggle, just his rifle, clean and upright, leaned against the door as if placed there by someone with care. Outside, the fog was thicker than before. The trees closer, the silence louder. Rennick didn't speak. He only packed his gear and stepped back into the pathless white, the others trailing, eyes low, breath shallow. Behind them, something creaked. Not wood, not wind. A sound like a question unanswered for too long. The march resumed with no change in pace, though something had cracked beneath the silence. They didn't speak of Keene. No one asked what might have happened, not even a whispered guess. The absence was not ignored. It was absorbed, folded into their movement like another layer of mud on their boots. Rennick led without compass, without signal, guided only by instinct and a growing pressure behind his temples, as if the fog itself had begun to seep into his thoughts. It wasn't just the cold that stiffened their fingers, nor the weight of the packs that slowed their feet. The air felt wrong. Time didn't pass. It clung. There was no sun, just gray, infinite level gray. They found a tree split from root to crown, bark peeled back like flesh. Names were carved into it, not recent ones, but old, etched in a slanted hand with dates too blurred to read. One name stood out fresher, deeper, A Store. One of the missing. His name hadn't appeared in any casualty reports. Dawson muttered that he'd spoken to Store 2 weeks before, near Ghent. Said the man kept humming even in sleep. Rennick stepped forward and touched the carving. The wood was warm, not damp warm, as if someone had just pulled their hand away. He said nothing, just turned and walked deeper into the trees. The second body was not buried. It sat upright on a rock beside the canal, eyes open, lips parted as if mid-prayer. His skin had no wounds, no bruises, just pale, frozen. In one hand, he clutched a photo smeared beyond recognition. In the other, a strip of paper folded in half. Rennick took it, unfolded it slowly, revealing a single line written in pencil. They only answer when you stop asking. No signature, no explanation. The soldier's tag had been removed, his coat unbuttoned, as if he'd waited for something to arrive. Dawson took a step back, then another. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but recognition. He had seen that pose before. In Normandy. In a church where 4 men had been found seated, untouched, unmoving, like statues waiting for the end of a mass that never came. They moved on in silence. No birds. No engines. The fog pulsed, now and then revealing distant shapes that never stayed long enough to be certain. A fence appeared, broken, rusted. Beyond it, a clearing, a path of ash. The ground was blackened but not burnt. No scent of smoke. No evidence of fire. Just ash where nothing should have burned. Rennick stepped onto it. The others hesitated. The soil beneath his boots felt brittle, hollow, as if beneath it lay a space, a cavity waiting to collapse. He moved forward anyway, drawn by something not entirely his own. At the center of the clearing stood a stone marker, covered in moss, cracked down the middle. It bore no language, no symbol, just a perfect circle carved into its face. Around it, the air felt warmer. The fog thinned. Then it grew cold again, suddenly. The warmth was not natural. It was a warning. That night, no one slept. They didn't speak of it, but they knew. The silence had deepened. There were no more distant sounds. No creaking trees or crunching brush. Just a low hum of breath and heartbeat, and the twitch of fingers on triggers. Rennick sat with his back to a tree, eyes open, staring into the gray. And then he heard it, faint, like a radio turned low. A voice. Not clear, not words, but rhythm. Familiar rhythm. A cadence of speech. And something deeper than that, emotion, regret, Recognition. He didn't wake the others. He stood and walked slowly toward the sound. It faded as he moved, then returned stronger when he stopped. He realized then it wasn't from ahead. It was beneath. He called for shovels. The men dug in silence, unsure if they were helping or cursing themselves. The ground gave way sooner than expected. Just under the ash, a hatch. Rusted, locked, marked with the same perfect circle they had seen earlier. It bore no handle, no hinges, no instructions. Just the silence pressing against it like breath from the other side. Rennick knelt, placed his hand flat against the metal. It was warm, then cold, then still. Behind him, someone whispered, "There's no key." He didn't ask who spoke. He just nodded, and the words returned to him like a memory not his own. They only answer when you stop asking. The fog moved, circling the trees like a tide returning to shore. Above them, the sky turned darker, though no stars emerged. The hatch remained sealed, but the silence had changed again. It wasn't absence. It was listening. They made no camp that night. There was no need. No one would sleep, and no one spoke of trying. The hatch lay exposed, a dull wound in the earth, its edges ringed with frost that hadn't been there hours before. Rennick sat beside it with his legs drawn up, boots resting against the scorched ash that hadn't burned. The others spread in a half-circle, their rifles across their laps, their eyes fixed on the tree lean. The wind had stopped again. The fog remained. The quiet was no longer natural. It had presence, as if something vast and ancient waited just beneath the surface of their thoughts, listening with breathless patience. And in that stillness, time loosened its grip. They didn't speak because speech felt foreign. Names slipped from memory. Faces blurred. Rennick found himself staring at his own hand, unsure when it had begun to tremble. At dawn, or what passed for it in that washed-out sky, the air changed. Not warmer, not colder, denser, as if the world had inhaled and forgot how to release. Moss grew in a ring around the hatch, fast and unnatural. Green where there had been only gray. A private named Elms reached for it, muttering about clearing it away, and before anyone could speak, the metal beneath his fingers pulsed. He yelped, pulled back, stared at his palm. A burn mark, faint but spreading, circular, matching the symbol. Dawson helped him bandage it, but no one else touched the hatch. Not that day. They moved, slowly, setting a perimeter, as if they could hold the forest back by habit alone. But the woods had shifted. Paths they'd marked were gone. Trees they'd leaned on were no longer there. Even the canal had moved, bending in ways the map did not permit. Rennick's boots crunched on gravel where there had been softer. The sound echoed wrong, too sharp like glass underfoot. He knelt and picked up a fragment. It wasn't glass. It was bone, thin like a bird's, but shaped like no animal he knew. More fragments scattered the path ahead, arranged in lines that curved toward a grove of trees leaning inward like conspirators. And from the center of those trees, a sound faint, deliberate, almost like fingers tapping on metal, but rhythmic, patterned. Morse. They gathered, weapons raised, though none believed in bullets anymore. The tapping stopped as they approached. In the clearing, another marker. Not stone, but wood, blackened with time. Upon it, 5 tags hung from rusted nails, swinging gently though there was no wind. Names etched by hand. All were from units they recognized. 2 belonged to men they'd been told were killed in Belgium years ago. 1 belonged to a man still listed as missing from the Ardennes. The 4th belonged to Private Keene. The 5th, they didn't read aloud. Rennick stared at it for a long time, then turned away. His own name. No rank. Just the letters carved in lines too shallow for time to have dulled. The others waited for an explanation, but he offered none. He didn't have one. He only knew it had been written by a hand that knew too much. The tapping returned that night, this time from beneath their feet. Rennick placed his ear to the hatch. The rhythm was not Morse. It was breathing, measured, human. He opened his notebook, one he hadn't written in for weeks. Inside, a line had appeared in his own handwriting. Ask the name, but do not answer back. He hadn't written it, not consciously. He turned the page. Blank. Another. Then, near the end, more lines. An exchange. Words scratched in different scripts, none of them his, but all in his notebook. Conversations he didn't remember, questions he didn't ask, and answers that felt like they had waited years to arrive. Dawson found him hours later still crouched there, pages scattered in the frost, mouth moving silently. The others gathered, drawn not by noise, but by the stillness. The hatch was warm again. The frost had melted from its rim, revealing new lines etched into the metal. Names, dozens of them, none from their unit, none from any report. But one of them recognized a name, a grandfather, dead in the First War. Another whispered the name of an uncle who had never come back from Italy. Each man found a name he had buried long ago, not just names of the dead, but of those who had vanished without story. And then the silence shifted again. No longer waiting. It had grown teeth. The hatch clicked, not open, not yet, but unlocked. The sound was soft, like breath passing between cracked lips. And from the trees, somewhere in the distance, a voice called out. One word, not a command, not a name. A question, spoken in a voice they recognized and could not name. It asked, "Do you remember me?" No one answered, but Rennick stood, lifted his rifle without aiming, and stared into the gray, where shadows moved like figures caught between waking and sleep. He didn't say it out loud, but the answer was yes. And that was enough. The hatch would open. It had always been waiting for that. They descended before first light. No ceremony, no briefing. Just the weight of names in their minds and the pressure of something unseen urging movement. Rennick went first, his boots scraping metal rungs slick with condensation. The air inside was damp and stale, but not untouched by life. It smelled of old cloth and rust, of dust that had not gathered, as if time had been interrupted here. The others followed in silence, one after the other, into a tunnel that hadn't appeared on a single map, and yet felt older than any of them could understand. The hatch closed above them without a sound. No one touched it. No one needed to. The corridor was narrow and sloped gently down, its walls lined with metal plates riveted in uneven patterns. Their flashlights swept across markings faded by moisture, symbols half erased, words and languages none of them had studied. Latin, perhaps, or something close. They passed doors that didn't open, alcoves with shattered glass, stairs that led upward into walls. Dawson counted their steps under his breath, then stopped abruptly. They had gone farther than the hillside should have allowed. Farther than the mountain was deep. He didn't say this. The silence forbade it. Rennick stopped before a sealed bulkhead with a rusted valve, his breath visible in the cold that gathered there. Beside the door, scratched into the wall by something sharper than a blade, were letters, not in any military code or cipher, but his mother's handwriting. His name, Michael. It took effort to look away. The others waited, watching him. He turned the valve. The door opened with the quiet weight of water pushing against memory. Beyond it, a hall, wide with a domed ceiling. Lights embedded in the floor glowed with pale amber, though no power source could be seen. The walls bore murals, but not painted, carved into the metal like tattoos into skin. Images of soldiers from different eras, Napoleonic, Roman, modern, marching not toward battle, but toward a void. Their faces blank, but somehow familiar. The more one stared, the more they shifted, taking on the expressions of men they had known and forgotten. A chamber opened to the right. Inside, long tables covered in fabric, medical or ritual, impossible to tell. Instruments rested beside bowls filled with black powder that had not settled despite the absence of motion. The walls were lined with photographs, aged and curling, all with faces scratched out. Only the backgrounds remained: barracks, mountains, kitchens, trenches, places from different wars, different times. And in each photo, somewhere hidden, the same object, a narrow, windowless door always ajar. Dawson touched one photo. It curled beneath his fingers and flaked away, revealing another beneath it. This one showed him as a boy, standing beside a man whose face had been removed. He dropped it and stepped back. The air grew denser. Elms muttered something about a draft, but there was no airflow, only the pressure of memory uninvited. They left the chamber without taking anything. The hall narrowed again, then opened into a room with burned walls, but only in certain sections. Flame marks ending in perfect lines. Not random, contained, preserved, In the center, a desk untouched by fire. On it, a box made of bone human, shaped into a rectangle, bound with thread. Rennick opened it. Inside, a single dog tag. Not metal, but wood, scorched at the edges. A name carved into it in Cyrillic. Elms couldn't read it, but Rennick could. It was the name of a man he had seen shot in the back in Belgium, long before any of this began. A man who had whispered something as he died, something Rennick had never understood until now. Not a curse, a warning. A door slid open to their left without being touched. The air that poured through was warm, scented with soil and copper. They stepped into a stairwell descending in tight spirals, walls lined with plaques bearing dates that never existed in history. Each plaque etched in a different script, none repeated. One of the dates was tomorrow's. At the base of the stairs, they found a long hall lit by coal bulbs humming at a frequency just above hearing. On the far wall, a map, but not of any country. A diagram of thoughts. Memories, maybe. Lines that intersected not in space, but in experience. Emotions charted like rivers. Fear converging with duty, loss bleeding into survival. No legend, no compass. Rennick's name was on it. Not as a label, but as a line. It ran from one corner to the center, where it stopped abruptly. Others branched from it. Names he didn't know, but felt. Lines that crossed his path and veered away, like those whose lives he had altered by living. The others found their own lines, some shorter, some frayed. Dawson's ended where his brother died. Elm's had no beginning, just an end. The map didn't explain itself. It didn't need to. The hallway ended in a door that looked like stone, but hummed when approached. There were no handles, no seams, only the symbol from the hatch, now pulsing faintly as if aware of them. Rennick raised his hand. The pulse quickened, not warning, welcoming. He paused, then let his palm rest against it. The stone softened, the door receded, and beyond it, not another room. Not walls or lights or machines. Just a space that felt like breath held for centuries. And at its center, a single object that neither glowed nor cast shadow. Something that had not burned because it had never lived. But it remembered, and it waited. It stood alone in the chamber, not a relic, not a device, not even an artifact that the mind could categorize. It looked like a stone and yet shimmered like it breathed, with veins of faint blue light coursing under its surface in rhythms that matched no heartbeat yet felt deeply human. No inscriptions, no seams, no signs of creation or decay. Rennick stepped closer, compelled not by duty or curiosity, but by something older than both. He heard nothing, yet a kind of pressure bloomed in his chest, like a word on the verge of being spoken, one he knew but couldn't recall. The other stood behind him, silent but not paralyzed. Elms narrowed his eyes. Dawson's lips moved without sound. No one touched it. The space around the object was unnaturally still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that doesn't simply lack motion, but denies the possibility of it. The air did not stir. Dust did not fall. Light did not flicker. And when Rennick finally turned his head away from the object, he noticed that their shadows had vanished. Not faded, not dimmed, gone, like the room had forgotten how to reflect. He looked back at the thing in the center and felt the pressure deepen, not into pain, but recognition. He had seen this before. Not here, not even in this war. In a fever dream in 1917, wounded in a trench, whispering to a chaplain who didn't answer. The chaplain's eyes had glowed the same way. Then it had seemed like death. Now it didn't. They left the room without a word. The door did not close behind them. It didn't need to. As they walked back through the spiral stairwell, the plaques had changed. The dates were the same. The scripts were the same. But now each plaque bore a phrase in a language they could all read. Sentences that were personal, specific. Each man found a sentence they had never said aloud, yet recognized instantly. Rennick's read, "You weren't supposed to survive or done." Elms, "She lied to protect you, not to abandon you." Dawson simply said, "You heard it too." Back in the corridor with the thought map, the lines had shifted. Some branched off into spirals. Others had thickened or disappeared. Where Rennick's path had once ended abruptly, a new trail now extended, thinner, less certain, but there. He didn't trace it with his fingers. He didn't need to. The hall had changed too. The metal of the walls felt warmer now, humming slightly with frequency below hearing. They passed the same room where the box of bone had been found, and it was empty, as if it had never been there, as if the discovery had only existed to bring them to the chamber. Time did not feel fractured anymore. It felt folded. Further on, they entered a section where the air was colder and the floors uneven. The lights flickered for the first time since they'd arrived. One by one, the bulbs went out behind them, like something closing a lid gently. Ahead, a single beam of red light cut across the floor. Elms raised his rifle, not at the source, but at the wall beside it, where a narrow slit had opened. From it, sound, barely a whisper, but not air. A voice, reading something, repeating the same lines. French, they realized. Old French. Lines from a poem none of them could place, but which made Dawson shudder. Rennick stopped walking. He mouthed the words, but not because he recognized the poem, because he had read them once, aloud, as a teenager in school, assigned by a professor who had vanished a week later, without explanation. The slit closed. The voice continued, though now from behind the wall. It was moving with them. No footsteps, just voice, then silence, then voice again. They passed another room, this one filled with chairs, all turned toward a wall painted black, as if awaiting a screen or sermon. The chairs were not dusty. The floor was clean. Elm sat in one without thinking. The others didn't stop him. The black wall shimmered, not with projection, but with something stranger, depth, a mirror with no reflection. Rennick looked and saw not his face, but the back of the room they had just exited, viewed from above. The chamber with the object. It was still there, but now the object was glowing brighter, and the room had more occupants. Not people. Forms. Too many to count. Still, watching. From behind something that wasn't glass, wasn't metal, wasn't even space. Just watching. Then the shimmer ended. Elms rose pale. He didn't speak. None of them did. They moved again. Not because they had a goal, but because stopping seemed worse than continuing. The corridor narrowed again, then opened into a chamber made of stone, not metal, ancient blocks, mortared by something dark and glossy. The center of the room held a lectern, and upon it, a question, not written, not spoken, but felt. It arrived in their thoughts, each man slightly differently, but all sharing the same essence. If it speaks back, will you listen? Dawson fell to his knees. Elms turned his back. Rennick stood still, and for a moment, the room waited, as if that was the only thing it had ever been built to ask. They left the chamber with nothing taken, nothing said, but the question remained, not haunting, anchoring, like a truth you don't want to hold but cannot set down. Behind them, the doorway sealed silently, and this time none of them looked back. They walked in silence, but it was not emptiness they carried. It was the weight of something they could not yet name, something waiting for an answer they still did not know how to give. The air was different past the stone threshold, not in temperature nor in scent, but in how it moved, or rather, how it didn't. It clung, still and unstirred, heavy not with dust or moisture, but with a suggestion of halted motion. The corridor twisted once more, descending slightly and narrowing just enough to feel intentional. The lights above remained dim, humming at that same maddening frequency, the one they could never quite locate, never fully tune out. Rennick walked ahead now, the others a pace behind, all of them changed, not by revelation, but by the absence of it. There was no climax to what they'd found, only accumulating disquiet. The silence wasn't just pervasive, it was personal. The chamber they entered wasn't built, but exposed. Unlike the others, with their clean lines and utilitarian purpose, this one was hewn directly from a mountain's core. The walls were jagged, moist in places, embedded with what looked like veins of black quartz or petrified roots. There was no symmetry here, no design to read. The floor sloped in places, curve in others. In the middle stood a single column, natural, but smoothed over as if touched for centuries. Atop it rested a circular frame of iron and glass, the sort once used for astronomical lenses. Only this one faced inward, not upward. Beneath it Symbols pulsed faintly, not etched, not painted, just present, like light under skin. Elms approached the lens first, against every instinct, and looked. He didn't recoil. He didn't speak. He just stepped back slowly, his face drained of something deeper than color. Dawson followed. His breath hitched when he looked, and he whispered, "That's not my memory." Rennick, though, did not look. Not yet. He circled the room, fingers trailing along the cold veins in the stone. His thoughts didn't race anymore. They pulsed, slow, deliberate, synchronized with something larger. There were no footsteps behind them now. No echoes either. Just the hum and the sense of being observed by something that didn't blink. When Rennick finally peered into the lens, he didn't see himself. He saw a boy no older than 6, standing in a field of ash, holding a feather. Not crying, not confused, just standing, as if waiting for someone who was late. Behind the boy, a city lay in ruins, but it wasn't a place Rennick recognized. And yet it felt, authored, like the dream of a city, built from the bones of other memories. The boy didn't move. Rennick tried to speak, but his throat tightened. He pulled back, heart quiet but pounding, a contradiction made flesh. He knew then, without doubt, the room wasn't showing visions. It was showing decisions, ones that hadn't yet been made, or ones they had made in another form, another version of themselves, lost to time but still echoing forward. They stayed in that room longer than any other, not out of paralysis, but because leaving it felt like walking away from an unfinished sentence. The lens didn't change. The boy remained. Each time they glanced again, it was the same scene, the same stillness. It was the only thing that hadn't shifted. Rennick spoke finally, not to the others, but to the room. If time doesn't move here, then choice must. No one responded. They just turned and left, back in the corridor. The markings had changed again. Not on the walls this time, but on them, on their hands. Faint ridges of warmth that traced invisible lines along the skin, like words written in heat. They didn't compare. They didn't need to. Each man bore something different. A phrase, a mark, an orientation towards something unnamed. As they walked, the hum in the walls sharpened, not in volume, but in character. It had gained shape, not quite music, but rhythm, not quite language, but cadence. Dawson began to mouth along, unconsciously, then stopped, startled. The words he spoke weren't his. They were his mother's. A lullaby, one she sang before the war, one she died singing. He didn't remember that until now. Rennick didn't stop him. Neither did Elms. They walked on, around the next bend. The corridor opened again, this time into a room that didn't look like any before. A library, or the remains of one. Walls lined with recesses, each housing thin slabs of something between metal and parchment, humming faintly, unreadable yet undeniably full. There were no chairs, no desks, just aisles, and in the center, a small pedestal with no contents. As they approached it, the humming shifted again. It was speech now, but in no tongue they knew. It wasn't meant for them. It was meant to be remembered, not translated. Rennick stepped toward one of the slabs and felt something click, not in the room, but in himself. A memory of a field, not his, a train, not his, a decision to stay behind, not his. The slab pulsed once. The memory didn't vanish, but folded away, tucked neatly behind his other thoughts. It was a gift and a burden and a question all at once. Elms touched nothing. Dawson reached out, then stopped. "I already know," he said, though to what, none of them could tell. They exited together, slower now, not from fatigue, but from the awareness that each step might not return them. Behind them, the room dimmed, but did not go dark. Something in it remained aware. Something always had. The corridor beyond was silent once more, but not empty. It carried the scent of stone and iron and something older, like burnt thread or dried ink. Ahead, the passage forked again. For the first time, the choice was theirs alone. No map, no markings. Just two paths. One curved downward, the other upward. They didn't speak. Rennick nodded toward the slope. Elms followed. Dawson hesitated, then joined. The air grew denser again, but not with fear. with finality. Something was nearing, not an end, but a threshold, and they were walking straight into it. The descent narrowed until even breath had to learn silence. The walls no longer bore the signs of engineering or war. They felt pre-human, like the inner ribs of something asleep beneath the mountain. There was no rust here, no dust, no signs of decay or passage. Only walls so smooth and dark they swallowed every glint from their lanterns. The ground beneath their boots no longer crunched. It pulsed. Rennick, at the front, slowed without meaning to. The path had ended, not in a wall, but in a room whose entrance wasn't marked by a door, only by temperature. One moment it was breath warm, and the next deathly cold. Inside, the chamber had no corners, no geometry, just angles that refused to meet. It was spherical in the way a whisper is spherical, no edges, only return. The three men entered cautiously, but the room offered no threat, no traps, no bones, only presence. In its center stood a cube no larger than a child's toy chest, with surface textures that changed each time one blinked. Wood, then metal, then stone, then something that looked like dried skin but shimmered like film. Elms was the first to speak, but the words died before they left his throat. Dawson's lips parted, but no sound followed. The air resisted language. Only Rennick remained still, unmoving, watching the cube with the expression of a man who's read this page before long ago, but can't recall what comes next. He stepped forward. The ground did not echo. The space behind him did not follow. When his hand hovered above the cube, it shifted again, revealing a faint seam. Not a lid, not a lock, just a separation. With a single breath, as if accepting something old and forgotten, Rennick pressed against it. The seam opened. No click, no hiss, no resistance. Inside was not an object, but a recess, lined with fine velvet black as the inside of an unlit eye. At the very bottom, nestled as if waiting for his return, was a notebook. No title, no clasp, just fabric that looked weathered, yet untouched by time. He opened it. Blank pages. Dozens more. Then midway, text appeared, not printed, not written, but formed like breath on glass. The ink came only when touched. His fingertips triggered words in French, in German, in WWII, all folding over one another. But as Rennick adjusted his grip, the page grew warm, and the ink turned red. It was not blood. It was not ink. It was something in between. Dawson approached, eyes fixed on the shifting symbols, and before Rennick could stop him, he reached out. The moment his skin touched the paper, the room responded. The walls rippled and a sound entered their skulls, not through ears, but marrow. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't speech. It was a name. Elms fell back, grabbing his ears though there was no sound. Rennick remained upright, staring down at the book. What he saw there no longer looked like language. It looked like memory, and it wasn't his. It belonged to Etienne, not in metaphor, not in vague resonance. It was his handwriting, the same loops and flourishes Rennick knew from years ago. The last time he'd seen it was on a note slipped into a rucksack, beneath a flask and a crumpled photograph. Now it returned, not as explanation, but continuation. We never left the mountain. We only left each other. If you're reading this, you found the breath of the wall. You heard her. She remembers us still. The page went blank. Another line appeared. I stayed because I had to. You came because you promised. But promise isn't choice. What you do now is yours alone. Then the book grew cold again and the ink faded, leaving only impressions in the paper like dry tears. Dawson stumbled back, mumbling something about radio signals. Elms crouched, arms folded, trying to push a noise out his head that hadn't come through his ears. Rennick closed the book. Behind them, the wall that had no door began to open, not by design, but by memory. The stone folded like paper, revealing not another corridor, but a space beyond architecture. No wires, no steel, just colorless expanse, and at its center, a chair. Facing away, still, waiting, none of them spoke. The cube sealed itself as if never opened. The notebook remained in Rennick's hands, warmer now. Its weight heavier than before, not in mass, but in meaning. The room no longer pulsed. It listened, And as they stepped to the threshold that had not been there before, they knew they were no longer walking into the mountain. They were walking deeper into a choice left unfinished, into the part of war that no bullet could resolve. What men are willing to remember, and what they're willing to become to forget it. The new corridor bent inward as if the mountain itself had been carved not by hands but by resonance. The air felt heavier, not in pressure but in presence, as though it carried more than just oxygen, an inheritance of sound, trapped and layered over decades. Elms refused to step forward, his knees trembling as he stood frozen at the threshold, whispering to himself like a man lost in childhood memory. Dawson pressed on, his face blank, jaw set as though bracing for impact that hadn't come. Rennick moved between them, eyes fixed not on the path ahead but on the book now bound his hand, like a wound that refused to close. The hallway narrowed but grew taller, the ceiling vanishing into shadow. A low hum began to rise, not mechanical, not organic, but something between the two. It didn't fill the space so much as outline it. And then, in the distance, the hum fractured. It broke into syllables. Not speech, not echo, a cadence, a rhythm, the unmistakable shape of human words, though delivered without breath, without pause, without origin. It grew louder as they walked, and soon the voice was undeniable. It was Etienne, not someone who sounded like him, not a memory of him, but his voice exactly, reciting lines from a play they had once performed at University Hall, before the war pulled them apart. Phaedra by Racine. The passage flowed not with performance but conviction, trembling with the urgency of a man who had not stopped speaking since the day he disappeared. The voice didn't reverberate. It wasn't carried by air. It was embedded in the walls themselves, etched into the vibrations of the concrete like ink into vellum. Dawson stopped, staring upward at nothing. "There's no source," he muttered. "No damn speaker. This isn't playback." Elms finally stepped forward, drawn now not by courage but by familiarity. "That's a live voice," he said, not asking. "A live feed." Rennick said nothing. He knew what they were hearing wasn't live. It was a voice trapped in time, replaying a moment with such intensity that time itself bent to accommodate its refusal to be forgotten. They reached the end of the corridor, where the sound was strongest. There was no door, just a single smooth panel embedded into the stone. Beneath it, a control panel marked with symbols, Latin, not German. 4 buttons, none labeled. Rennick didn't touch them. Instead, he raised a notebook. The warmth surged again. A line appeared on the page, as if answering a question he hadn't spoken. He never stopped. The mountain remembers. To end the voice, you must answer it. Answer it, not silence it. The voice shifted. It stopped reciting the play and began speaking in prose, directly to someone, directly to Rennick. It spoke of maps they had once drawn together in chalk, of codes disguised as jokes, of cigarettes shared in trenches that neither of them admitted to fearing. Then it said something he hadn't heard since 1939. "Tu savais que je resterai, Claude. C'est toi qui m'as demandé." "You knew I would stay, Claude. You asked me to." The voice broke something open in him. Not sorrow, not guilt, the recognition that what had haunted him wasn't abandonment, but obedience. Etienne hadn't disappeared. He had obeyed. And Rennick, through a moment of fear disguised as strategy, had asked his closest friend to remain behind. A choice, a betrayal, spoken as a pact. The voice began to stutter, not from weakness, but as if it sensed it was being understood for the first time. The cadence unraveled, the pitch cracking. The mountain itself began to shift with it, groaning beneath the weight of its own memory. Rennick placed the notebook against the wall. The symbols on the panel lit up. The voice paused. Then, clear and unmistakable, it said one last thing. "Don't open the door. You already let me out." And silence followed. Not absence of sound, the presence of silence. Thick, final, absolute. Elms turned to run. Dawson backed against the far wall, whispering that the panel was a trigger, a fail-safe, a system. Rennick didn't move. The notebook closed itself in his hands. And behind the wall, something sighed, not breath, not wind, but the release of a voice that had been waiting too long to be heard. The silence that followed wasn't mercy. It was a waiting, A hush so deliberate that it took effort not to speak into it, to resist a reflex to fill the space with explanation, with human noise. But Claude Rennick understood that this place had no interest in being understood. It didn't want answers. It wanted decisions. He turned from a wall where Etienne's voice had faded and looked toward the western end of the corridor, where the rock had begun to shift. Not collapse, not give way. Shift, like something was adjusting to a new understanding of itself. The corridor's shape was different now. The shadows no longer obeyed the geometry of the light, and in the space where no door had existed, a passage appeared. No hinges, no frame, just a breach in the rock that pulsed with cold. He knew before the others that this was the final chamber. The notebook was no longer reacting. Its pages remained blank, inert. Whatever message had been hidden within had served its purpose, or perhaps it consumed its last drop of memory in the telling. Rennick slid it into his coat and stepped forward past the other two. Elms made the sign of the cross again, muttering something half Latin, half broken prayer. Dawson pulled the map out of his rucksack again, as though still hoping for a landmark to ground him. But Rennick was done with maps. Maps were made for terrain. This was something else. This was the architecture of confession. Inside the chamber, there were no tools, no evidence of work, no indicators of function. Just a pedestal, about waist-high, carved from the same volcanic stone that made up the mountain's core. It was rough, unfinished, almost crude, except for the indentation at the top, shaped like the outline of a hand. Not a mold, not a scanner. It had no technological function. It simply waited. Above it, embedded in the wall, was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels still, but it was powered. A faint hum vibrated through the stone, beneath his boots. Rennick didn't ask who the message was for. He didn't ask what the voice had meant by, "You let me out." He placed his hand in the indentation. The tape reels began to spin. There was no click, no hiss of activation, just a voice. His voice, not in French, not in Wa, but in the thin, careful tone he had once used to record topographical notes during the war. A voice made mechanical by duty, now resurrected in a place where geography no longer mattered. But the words were not his, not from any report he remembered giving. The message was for him, from a version of himself he had not yet become, a confession left in reverse. The voice spoke of an agreement, of a pact between two officers, Claude and Etienne, of a mission that had gone off record, buried beneath a false designation, of an encounter in the lower tunnels, where signals had been tested and responses received, but not from any Allied or Axis command. The voice told of listening too long, of a decision to stay, of another decision to forget. The voice said, "If you're hearing this, then you kept your promise. You came back, but the silence no longer needs guardians. It needs closure." Then came a fragment of Etienne's voice again, recorded not in words, but in breath, a single inhalation, deep and resigned, followed by stillness. Rennick withdrew his hand. The reel stopped, but something remained in motion. Behind the pedestal, a panel of rock slid away, revealing a staircase descending into pure black. No light, no air current, not even the smell of earth. Just a choice. Elms begged him not to go. Dawson tried to block the way with his body. Rennick didn't argue. He simply removed his coat, placed a notebook atop it, and stepped past him. His foot crossed the threshold. The darkness welcomed him like a language he had always known, but never dared speak aloud. And behind him, for the first time in days, came a human sound. Elms wept, not for fear, but for understanding, for memory. Rennick descended, step by step, until the black swallowed him. No cries followed, no voices echoed, just the silence again. But this time it was whole. The final descent was not marked by gravity alone, but by a deepening of perception, as though each step unspooled another layer of meaning he had carried unknowingly all his life. There was no light, yet Claude Rennick saw, not with eyes, but with memory, with consequence. The stairway spiraled through silence so absolute it seemed to press against his eardrums, humming not with sound but with withheld sound, as if the walls were restraining voices that remembered too much. He passed alcoves, empty but familiar, shaped like rooms that had never housed bodies, only decisions. The rock here pulsed not with warmth, but with memory, every surface absorbing every breath ever drawn in defiance of orders, every whisper spoken too late, every scream swallowed before it reached the throat. Rennick had stopped counting steps, not because he had lost track, but because the descent had ceased to be vertical. He was not going deeper in space anymore, but further in time, retracing a moment long buried beneath years of denial. When the stairs ended, they did so without warning. One moment his boot met stone, the next it met stillness. He stood in a circular chamber, wider than it had any right to be. The ceiling arched not in support, but in judgment, its shape recalling the acoustics of old cathedrals where even lies echoed beautifully. At the center stood a chair, plain military issue, bolted into the floor. Before it, another reel-to-reel machine, this one surrounded by empty canisters. Their labels faded. One tape remained threaded. Above it, carved in WA, German, and French, record what must not return. He sat, not because he was tired, but because he knew it had to end with speech. The microphone was already live. The reel waited. No countdown, no operator, just the weight of what had never been said. He leaned forward and spoke. My name is Lieutenant Claude Rennick, former interpreter, former cartographer, and former coward. He paused. I came here to fulfill a promise, to silence something we woke under pretense of war. But what we found wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror, one that plays your own voice back to you, not as it sounds, but as it means. There is a place beneath Monty Surat where echoes do not bounce, they listen. And when they learn enough, they answer. The reel turned. I heard a voice. His voice. Etienne. But it wasn't just memory. It wasn't a ghost. It was intention. I believe now that he stayed because he understood something the rest of us never dared to admit. Some truths must be contained, not buried, because burial invites return. Containment is an act of will. He reached into his coat, though he no longer wore it. The notebook was there, blank again. He placed it on the console. The experiments were never about breaking enemy codes. They were about listening past the limits of language, about finding where voices went when forgotten. The Allies shut the program down. The Nazis tried to claim it. But this place never belonged to them. It was older than Rome, older than myth. He leaned back. The chair groaned beneath his weight, as though it remembered every officer who had sat here before him. To whoever finds this, if you find this, know that the voice is still here, but not out of malice. It waits for meaning. Do not speak unless you intend to stay. Do not stay unless you mean to forget. And if you must ring the bell again, be ready to answer it. He stopped recording. The reel slowed, then reversed. The voice that came next was not his. It was Etienne, but not the young man he remembered, not the one who smoked with trembling hands during training, or recited Molière in the barracks to keep the night away. This was a voice stretched thin by years, by gravity that had nothing to do with age. And yet it spoke with calm. Thank you, Claude. Now it can rest. And the chamber began to close. The stone above shifted. Dust rained down. The lights, which had never been visible, dimmed into non-existence. And as the ceiling met the floor, as the air compressed into stillness, the silence returned, not as absence, but as preservation. It held within it every voice, every name, every choice made without applause. Outside, Elms and Dawson found the entry sealed. The tunnel had vanished. The map showed nothing. The mountain stood unchanged. And somewhere, deep below, a reel spun once more, not to play, not to record, but simply to remember. For silence, too, has a memory.